Hello and welcome to the Sleep to Lore series. Tonight we travel along the path of the beam to a farming village known as Calla Bryn Sturgis. In this installment of the Dark Tower saga, Roland and his ka-tet encounter a community living in fear of the wolves, robotic raiders that come once a generation to steal children. We will explore the tragedy of Father Callahan, the secret of the Dogan, and the countdown to a battle that will decide the fate of the roses and the tower itself. Before we begin, I have a question for you. If you knew an overwhelming threat was coming to your neighborhood in exactly 30 days, would you pack up and run, or would you stay and prepare to fight? Let me know in the comments below. While you're down there sharing your thoughts, if you enjoy these deep dives, please subscribe and leave a like. As a new channel, every member who joins is helping to build this library of lore from the ground up. If you want to support these deep dives, click the join button below. Now, settle in, let the outside world fade away, and let's step into the shadows of the Calla. Beneath a sky heavy with the threat of an endless suffocating heat, a man named Tian labors in a cursed rocky tract of land that yields little more than shattered hopes and blistered hands. He is driven by a quiet, desperate madness, a refusal to accept the barren reality of his world. In this unforgiving dirt, he dreams of cultivating something precious, a rare spice, an impossible harvest. But the true psychological weight of Tian's existence is not found in the stones he clears, but in the beast of burden harnessed to his plough. It is not an ox, nor a mule. It is his own twin sister. She is a towering, physically massive woman with the mind of a vacant child. In the local tongue of this borderland community, she is referred to as ruined, the tragic aftermath of a horrific generational tax. The village of Calla Bryn Sturgis sits in the shadow of a dark, impenetrable frontier, and for longer than anyone can accurately remember, they have been subjected to an unthinkable harvest. Masked riders on grey horses descend from the high country, once a generation, to steal exactly half of the town's children. When these stolen twins are eventually returned, their minds have been scooped out, leaving behind nothing but hulking, obedient shells. It is a profound, communal trauma, one that the village has normalized into a grim agricultural cycle. They have learned to treat their own offspring as a renewable resource, a tithe paid to an enigmatic, technologically superior evil to ensure the survival of their farms. This fragile, nightmarish complacency is shattered on this sweltering afternoon by the arrival of a relic from a forgotten technological age. An impossibly tall, skeletal robot, gleefully stamped with corporate logos of a dead civilization, strides into the rocky field. Its permanent metallic smile is a grotesque contrast to the sweating, bleeding reality of the human struggle before it. The machine serves as a messenger, a tireless wanderer who deals in horoscopes and local gossip. But today, its mechanical voice delivers the ultimate dread. The riders are coming. In 30 days, a single cycle of the moon, the nightmare will return to claim its fresh crop of flesh. Hearing this, something fractures within the weary farmer. For generations, the men and women of this village have bowed their heads, absorbing the agony of their stolen future with the stoicism of livestock bracing for a winter storm. But as Tian looks at his sister, reduced to a braying, hollow beast of burden, a completely foreign emotion begins to boil within his chest. It is not the familiar cold grip of terror. It is absolute blinding rage. It is the definitive breaking point of human endurance. He unharnesses his sister and returns to his homestead. His wife, sensing the catastrophic shift in the atmosphere, looks upon their own 5 children, 2 sets of twins among them, with the primal, suffocating panic of a mother cornered by predators. The dread is a physical weight in the room. But Tian refuses to succumb to the ancestral cowardice. He summons the entire community, initiating an ancient protocol to gather the men of the village. The town hall meeting that follows is a masterclass in the psychology of mass complacency and the paralyzing effects of systemic abuse. The atmosphere is thick with defeat. When Tian reveals the 30-day countdown, the room fractures into terrifying coping mechanisms. A sect of local mystics, their eyes burning with fanaticism, actually suggests a mass preemptive euthanasia of the children, arguing that death is a purer mercy than the lobotomized husk of the ruined ones. It is a horrifying testament to how deeply the oppressors have warped the moral compass of the oppressed. But the true ideological rot is exposed by the village's wealthiest landowners. These men, comfortable in their large estates and secure in the knowledge that their own adult children are safe, advocate for absolute submission. They weaponize pragmatism, arguing that resistance is suicidal. They remind the terrified farmers of the oppressors' ancient devastating weaponry, flying spheres of razor-sharp metal, rods that project burning light. They rationalize the sacrifice of the children as a mere business expense, an unfortunate but necessary overhead to prevent the burning of their precious fields and barns. It is the ultimate manifestation of the bystander effect, a community actively convincing itself that cowardice is actually wisdom. Tian tries to fight this tide of institutionalized cowardice, pleading that every time they surrender their children, they hollow out the spiritual core of their society. He warns that a tree stripped of its heartwood repeatedly will eventually rot from the inside out, even if its leaves still appear green. But his passionate pleas are drowned out by the smooth, fear-mongering rhetoric of the wealthy elite. The town is on the verge of officially voting for its own continued victimization. Then, a voice slices through the suffocating cowardice. It belongs to the village's spiritual leader, an outsider bearing the physical and psychological scars of his own dark history. This aging priest, a man who intimately understands the corrosive, spreading infection of cowardice from his past encounters with pure evil in other dimensions, refuses to let the town lie to itself. He strips away their pragmatic excuses, labeling their submission as pathetic, dog-like obedience. And then, he drops a revelation that electrifies the stagnant air. They do not have to fight alone. Moving steadily toward their doomed village, walking an ancient, invisible line of metaphysical force, is a band of mythical warriors. These are not mere mercenaries. They are the last surviving knights of a ruined empire, the legendary peacekeepers of a world that has moved on. The impossible has manifested. The myth is walking out of the wilderness, and the town must finally decide if it has the courage to stand behind it. The face of time on the water. Far away from the terrified debates of the farming village, the legendary warriors in question are wrestling with a far more abstract nightmare. Their journey along the invisible, magnetic corridor that holds the universe together has devolved into a surreal, psychological purgatory. Ever since their violent confrontation with a manic, suicidal artificial intelligence and their terrifying exposure to an ageless demonic sorcerer in a palace of green glass, the very fabric of reality has begun to fray around them. The most unsettling casualty of this environmental decay is the concept of time itself. For the displaced New Yorker pushing his paraplegic wife's wheelchair through the endless decaying brush, time has lost its linear authority. He theorizes with a growing sense of existential dread that time is not a constant progression, but a localized phenomenon dependent on external events. When the world is chaotic and dangerous, time accelerates. But in this desolate, empty stretch of dying landscapes, where the sky is a perpetual cloudy twilight and the seasons seem to blend into a muddy autumnal purgatory, time has simply stagnated. It feels like a shallow, still pond, reflecting a distorted reality. They are becalmed in a temporal void, marching for what feels like weeks, or perhaps mere hours, without a single milestone to anchor their sanity. To combat the crushing silence of this temporal twilight, they share stories. The exile from New York recounts the fairy tales of his youth, spinning narratives of lost children, candy houses, and child-eating witches. But the ancient gunslinger leading them does not consume these stories with the wide-eyed wonder of an entertainer. He listens with the cold, clinical detachment of an anthropologist studying a newly discovered civilization. He dissects their folklore, searching for strategic insights into the psychological architecture of his companion's home dimension. He recognizes the universal archetypes, the sacrificial children, the dark woods, the deceptive monsters, because the fundamental nature of survival is identical across all realities. Yet, a far more insidious psychological phenomenon is infecting their collective unconscious. A highly specific, seemingly arbitrary prime number has begun to haunt their daily routines. It appears in the arrangement of branches they gather for the fire. It echoes in the geometry of the ancient dying trees. It becomes a bizarre, unspoken punchline to their conversations. It is a synchronicity so pervasive that it borders on the supernatural. The ancient gunslinger, intimately familiar with the unseen currents of fate, recognizes this not as a mere coincidence, but as a metaphysical virus. They are bound together so tightly by destiny that their subconscious minds are bleeding into one another, creating a shared obsession. The universe is speaking to them in numerical code, a constant, eerie reminder that their free will might be nothing more than an illusion written by a higher power. This hypnotic, stagnant rhythm is finally broken by the youngest member of their group, a boy ripped from a privileged life in a towering metropolis. While scouting the periphery of their path, he discovers a clearing filled with strange, horned fruits. But it is not the visual anomaly that strikes him. It is the scent. The bizarre flora emits the exact comforting aroma of fresh sourdough bread from an upscale Manhattan deli. It is a violent collision of dimensions, a sensory anchor to a lost childhood, manifesting in a dying alien forest. More importantly, the boy's heightened instincts, a psychic sensitivity that is rapidly sharpening under the gunslinger's silent tutelage, detect a flaw in their isolation. They are being watched. There are human trackers lurking in the dense, ancient foliage behind them. When the boy reports this intrusion, expecting a tactical, violent response, the gunslinger's reaction is unnervingly placid. He reveals that he has known about the stalkers for days. He did not withhold this information out of malice, but as a calculated psychological test of his apprentices. He is constantly evaluating their situational awareness, waiting to see whose survival instincts would pierce the veil of the forest first. Furthermore, the gunslinger dismisses the trackers with a quiet, lethal arrogance. If the unseen watchers possessed any true predatory skill, the ambush would have already happened. Instead, they are clumsy, hesitant, and loud, amateurs stumbling through the dark, fundamentally outmatched by the apex predators they are foolishly attempting to follow. As evening consumes the ancient woods, the group settles in the middle of a ruined road, cooking the strange, bread-scented harvest over a small fire. The mundane act of eating feels heavy, with an unspoken anticipation. The temporal stagnation has finally shattered. The invisible clock of the universe has resumed its ticking, winding up for a violent convergence. The gunslinger offers a cryptic, almost paternal warning as they prepare to sleep. The local flora they just consumed has a tendency to strip away the boundaries between the waking world and the subconscious. It does not intoxicate, but it renders dreams violently lucid, blurring the lines of reality. As the fires die down and the pathetic, distant spark of their pursuers' camp flickers in the deep woods, the exiles surrender to the dark. But for the young man from New York, the promised dream does not feel like a hallucination. There is no hazy, ethereal fog of sleep. The transition is instantaneous, hyper-real, and terrifyingly concrete. The smell of the ancient, decaying forest vanishes, replaced instantly by the sharp, metallic tang of urban exhaust. The soft earth beneath him turns into hard, unforgiving concrete. He stands on the corner of 2nd Avenue in a bustling, vibrant Manhattan. The sensory overload is absolute, and as the boy and his strange, golden-eyed animal companion turn the corner to greet him, a chilling, exhilarating realization washes over him. The stagnant pond of time has not just started flowing again, it has violently reversed its current. The game has truly begun, and the boundary between worlds has utterly collapsed. Echoes of a 1977 groove. The transition from the waking world of Midworld to the spectral realm of a forgotten past begins not with a physical jolt, but with a profound sensory dissonance. The boy, Jake Chambers, drifts into a heavy slumber surrounded by a starless, suffocating darkness, only to be seized by that visceral, stomach-dropping sensation of plummeting. It is a terrifying regression to his old life, the life of a heavily pressured Manhattan schoolboy plagued by anxiety dreams. But the falling ceases, replaced by a melody. It is a chiming sequence, impossibly beautiful, yet laced with an insidious threat. It resonates deep within the marrow, a seductive but lethal harmony that feels tangentially related to the sinister, fabric-tearing sounds of the magical anomalies known as thinnies. This is the sound of the boundaries between realities breaking down. When the red glare behind Jake's eyelids shatters into blinding daylight, he is no longer in the quiet, decaying wilderness of Roland's world. He is thrust into the deafening, kinetic roar of 1977 New York City. The sensory whiplash is absolute. Yellow cabs streak past, pedestrians bop to the rhythm of early portable cassette players, and the brutal percussion of jackhammers echoes against the concrete canyons. Jake, alongside his loyal Billy Bumbler Oy and a thoroughly bewildered Eddie Dean, stands in the middle of this urban chaos, dressed in the ragged, blood-stained leathers of gunslingers. Yet the city ignores them. They are phantoms. The pedestrians subconsciously alter their paths to avoid stepping on them, an eerie testament to their presence being felt rather than seen. They are interlopers trapped behind the glass of time, ghosts haunting a world that has already moved on. The psychological weight of this temporal displacement hits a breaking point when Jake witnesses a ghost of his own making, his younger self. The boy walking down the avenue is John Chambers on the very day he skipped out on his elite private school, fleeing the crushing weight of his unraveling sanity. Watching this past iteration of himself, the current Jake is struck by a profound sense of protective pity. He observes the softness, the sheer fragility of the boy who has yet to endure the horrors of the doorkeeper, the mind-shattering paradox of his dual deaths, and the brutal tutelage of the gunslinger. It is a moment of deep psychological horror and melancholy. We are forced to ask ourselves how we would react if we could stand on the sidewalk and watch our most vulnerable, naive selves march unknowingly toward a crucible of suffering. Eddie is equally paralyzed by the cosmic absurdity of the situation, a reaction he masks with his trademark defensive humor. But the humor fades when they notice the underlying wrongness of the world. Yes, the sun is shining on the chrome bumpers, but there is a pervasive, suffocating darkness lurking just beneath the visual surface. It is as if the vibrant city is merely a thin layer of paint, stretched precariously over an infinite hungry void. The reality here is sick, hollowed out by the creeping decay of the Dark Tower. The trio tracks the younger Jake to a local bookstore, a sanctuary of dusty tomes owned by Calvin Tower and his friend Aaron Deepno. Here, the subtle infections of a dying multiverse become apparent. The young Jake purchases a seemingly innocent children's book about a sentient train, but the timeline has already begun to warp. The author of the book, once a woman named Beryl Evans, has been overwritten by reality itself, replaced by a strange pseudonym with exactly 19 letters. The number 19 is the fingerprint of the cosmic rot, a structural flaw in the architecture of destiny that constantly bleeds into their lives. The tension escalates from existential dread to immediate visceral threat when a dark luxury car pulls up to the bookstore. Out step 3, men who make Eddie Dean's blood turn to ice. It is Enrico Balazar and his lethal enforcers, Jack Andolini and George Biondi. To the listener, this is a masterclass in the terrifying circularity of fate. Eddie is staring at the very mobsters who will one day enslave him to a heroin addiction, the very men he and Roland are destined to slaughter in a bloody shootout a decade in the future. Watching these dead men walking, Eddie is trapped in a paralyzing paradox, a helpless observer to the mechanics of his own tragic history. The mobsters are here to strong-arm the bookstore owner, who holds the deed to a vacant lot. A lot that houses a single magical rose, the physical manifestation of the Dark Tower in this universe. Driven by an unseen cosmic compulsion, Eddie forces his ghostly form through a closed door into the back room to spy on the confrontation. He witnesses a legal document, an agreement that proves a sinister corporate entity is attempting to seize the land. The mobsters are merely the blunt instruments of an ancient, multi-dimensional evil. But before Eddie can gather more than fragments of the contract, the beautiful lethal chimes return. The fabric of the 1977 timeline begins to shred. The shadows in the room leap and twist, and the underlying cosmic void breaks through the canvas of reality. With a deafening roar that threatens to tear their minds apart, Eddie, Jake, and Oi are violently ripped from the past, plunged back into the swirling, terrifying darkness of the spaces between worlds. The gluttony of the divided mind. To understand the sheer psychological terror of what happens next in the dead of the mid-world night, one must first understand the fragmented architecture of Susanna Dean's mind. She was once Odetta Holmes, a wealthy, poised activist of the civil rights era, who unknowingly shared her body with Detta Walker, a feral, hateful manifestation of her deepest traumas. The gunslinger, Roland, forced these two halves to merge, creating Susanna, a woman of immense strength and love. But the mind is a fragile vessel, and trauma, especially supernatural trauma, leaves deep fault lines. Now, an unprecedented stressor has cracked her psyche wide open once again, giving birth to a fourth entity, Mia. Mia, whose name translates simply to mother in the ancient high speech of Midworld, cares nothing for the moral compass of Odetta, the survival instincts of Detta, or the deep romantic love of Susanna. Mia has only one prime directive: to feed the unnatural, rapidly growing entity incubating in her womb. The psychological defense mechanisms at play here are staggering. As Mia takes control of Susanna's paralyzed body in the dead of night, her mind constructs a magnificent, impenetrable delusion to shield herself from the grotesque reality of her actions. In her mind's eye, Mia is descending the grand, sweeping staircases of an opulent, ancient castle belonging to the mythical King Arthur Eld. She envisions a spectacular banquet hall, illuminated by blazing electric torches featuring a sprawling table groaning under the weight of an aristocratic feast. There are roasted meats dripping with fat, exotic seafood, rich cheeses, and delicate crystal goblets of wine. It is a delusion of grandeur, a psychological safe room designed to justify the monstrous gluttony required to sustain her parasitic pregnancy. But the reality is a stark, stomach-churning nightmare. Mia has left her wheelchair behind. Stripped naked, wearing only the leather pads over her amputated stumps, she slithers through a freezing, decaying swamp. She navigates the treacherous, muck-filled bog with the predatory grace of an alligator. Roland of Gilead follows her in the shadows, an invisible guardian. The gunslinger's perspective provides a chilling clinical detachment to the horror. He watches as the woman his surrogate son loves hunts in the moonlight. He observes the horrific juxtaposition of her internal delusion and her external reality. In Mia's mind, she is elegantly sampling caviar and exchanging pleasantries with the high society ghosts of the civil rights movement. In the physical swamp, her lightning-fast hands snatch a living frog from the reeds. She crushes it in her grip, the creature bursting between her fingers, and eagerly devours it raw, licking the blood and viscera from her skin. The auditory hallucinations bleeding from her lips are a haunting symphony of madness. She chatters amiably in Odetta's refined cadence about political assassinations and folk music, only to suddenly violently hurl an imaginary plate against an imaginary wall, screaming obscenities in Detta Walker's vicious guttural roar. All the while, she is snatching binny bugs from the air, crushing water rats between her teeth, and swallowing them whole before violently regurgitating the indigestible bones and fur. This sequence is a profound exploration of body horror and the loss of autonomy. Susanna is a prisoner in her own flesh, utterly unaware that her body is being hijacked by an ancient maternal drive that reduces her to a feral beast. Roland, watching from the tree line, is forced to bear the crushing weight of this secret. He calculates the inevitable, devastating fallout this will cause for Eddie. Eddie, who loves Susanna desperately, will undoubtedly want to believe the child is his, blinding himself to the monstrous, primal cravings that prove the chap growing inside her is something entirely alien and demonic. Roland's stoicism in the face of this nightmare is both admirable and terrifying. He does not intervene. He merely ensures she does not drown or fall prey to a larger predator, carefully erasing his own tracks to maintain the illusion that she is merely sleeping safely by the fire. When Mia finally cleanses herself of the swamp muck and returns to the camp, seamlessly slipping back into Susanna's resting form, Roland watches her place a tender, loving kiss on Eddie's sleeping brow. It is a moment of profound, tragic irony. The monster has retreated, leaving the beloved wife in its wake, but the gunslinger knows the hunger will return, and the reckoning that will follow will test the very foundations of their found family, a palaver of ghosts and guardians. When the bleak morning light finally breaks over the camp, the shadows of the night's horrors linger, heavily disguised by the mundane rituals of brewing camp tea and eating scavenged food. Susanna awakens, complaining only of stiffness and a remarkably deep sleep, completely oblivious to the bloody feral feast her alter ego partook in hours before. Roland, ever the stoic sentinel, offers nothing to shatter her illusion. Instead, the focus shifts to Eddie and Jake, who are visibly rattled, their faces drawn with the exhaustion of men who have peered over the edge of the universe. They recount their involuntary astral projection to the gunslinger. Roland identifies the phenomenon as Todash space, a concept taught to him in his youth by his wise tutor, Vane. To go to Dash is to have one's consciousness untethered from their physical form, allowing them to drift through the void between dimensions. It is not a safe or controlled method of travel like the physical doorways they have encountered before. It is a precarious, violent tethering to the currents of destiny, heavily influenced by the gravitational pull of the Dark Tower and the magical pathways known as the beams. The campfire discussion, or palaver, shifts into a tactical analysis of the cosmic chess game they are caught in. Eddie pieces together the puzzle of 1977 New York. The Sombra Corporation, a front for the demonic forces working to collapse the multiverse, is slowly squeezing Calvin Tower to sell the vacant lot. The lot houses the Rose, the physical anchor of the Dark Tower in that specific reality. If the Rose is destroyed, the entire universe crumbles into the void. Eddie realizes that Tower is fighting a losing battle of attrition, holding onto the property out of a subconscious mystical compulsion to protect the white. The solution they arrive at is breathtaking in its audacity, showcasing the unique advantage of a multidimensional family. They must manipulate the timelines. Susanna, as Odetta Holmes, possesses a vast corporate fortune in the year 1964. They formulate a plan to open a doorway to 1964 withdraw millions in untraceable cash from her notoriously stubborn godfather and accountant, Moses Carver, and transport that cash forward to 1977 to buy the lot from Calvin Tower before the Sombra Corporation can execute their hostile takeover. It is a desperate heist spanning decades and dimensions. However, Roland gently curtails their optimism. He reminds them that the doorways between worlds are not simple subway turnstiles. They are impossibly rare, highly volatile tears in reality. The ability to aim a door at a specific year, let alone two different eras, is a magical feat of staggering complexity. The cosmic scales are balancing against them, and the arbitrary cruelty of time is a river that waits for no one. The tension of their strategic planning is suddenly punctured by an arrival. Emerging from the tree line is a figure who entirely shatters the boundaries of Stephen King's mythos. He is an older man, wearing the reversed collar of a Catholic priest. He introduces himself as Donald Callahan, late of the town of Salem's Lot, Maine. For the listener, this is an explosive collision of worlds. Father Callahan, the disgraced vampire-hunted priest from an entirely different narrative universe, has found his way into the heart of Midworld. His presence solidifies the terrifying reality that all worlds, all stories, are bleeding together as the Dark Tower decays. Callahan explains that he now resides in a nearby borderland community called Calla Bryn Sturgis. He has tracked them down on behalf of the townspeople to beg for their salvation. Once a generation, horrific, mechanized entities known only as the Wolves ride out from the irradiated wasteland of Thunderclap to steal the town's children, returning them months later as severely brain-damaged, overgrown husks. The town is paralyzed by fear, internally divided on whether to submit to the slaughter or finally stand and fight. Callahan hopes the legendary presence of true gunslingers will tip the scales toward rebellion. Roland's response is a chilling testament to the ancient code of his extinct order. He coldly rebukes the priest's desperate plea. The gunslingers of Gilead are not mercenaries. They do not fight for hire, nor can they be swayed by emotional appeals. They serve only the white, and their involvement is dictated entirely by the mysterious, inexorable pull of Ka. Roland demands that the townspeople come to him, to hold a formal council, and only if all parties agree to absolute, unwavering commitment will the gunslingers draw their weapons. It is a harsh, uncompromising stance, highlighting the heavy, bloody burden of being a knight in a world that has forgotten honor. But Callahan has a final, devastating bargaining chip. He lowers his voice, radiating a palpable aura of dread, and addresses their recent, violent slip into Tadash space. The priest reveals that he is the reluctant guardian of an object of pure, concentrated evil. Hidden beneath the floorboards of his church in the Calla is Black 13, the largest, most malevolent orb of the magical artifacts known as the Wizard's Rainbow. Black 13 is not merely a tool. It is a sentient, hungry entity that thrives on the madness and destruction of the minds that dare to look into it. Callahan confesses, tears streaming down his weathered face, that the orb has recently awakened. It is pulsing with dark life, and its psychic radiation is likely the very thing that violently ripped Eddie and Jake into the 1977 timeline. The priest is begging them to take it away, to rid him of a cursed artifact that is actively communicating with the outer dark. The revelation of Black 13 hangs over the campfire like a suffocating shroud, but the final insidious twist of the morning comes from Jake's backpack, as the group reels from the mention of a specific influential farmer in Callahan's town, a man whose name impossibly matches the very author Calvin Tower mentioned in 1977. Jake pulls out his cherished children's book. He opens Charlie the Choo-Choo, seeking the familiar comfort of its pages. Instead, he finds the terrifying proof of reality's imminent collapse. The physical book has altered itself. The author's name, once clearly printed on the cover, has vanished into thin air. He flips frantically to the copyright page, searching for the anchor of logical publication data. but the page is utterly blank save for a single line of text. Copyright 1936. The digits 1, 9, 3 and 6 add up exactly to 19. The cosmic fingerprint is there, mocking them from the pages of a child's story. It is a chilling confirmation that the decay of the Dark Tower is not a distant, abstract threat. The rot is here, infiltrating their possessions, their memories, and the very fabric of the worlds they seek to save. The palaver ends not with a triumphant battle plan, but with the creeping, inescapable dread that time is running out and the darkness is already inside the gates. The quiet observer. Susanna Dean watches the world unfold from the unique vantage point of a woman who has learned how to be entirely unseen. On this long, overcast morning, she feels a profound sense of physical relief. The nagging, phantom pains in her side, the persistent exhaustion, and the morning nausea that had plagued her for weeks have finally evaporated. While she desperately harbors a deep, almost primal yearning to carry Eddie's child, a beacon of life in a dying universe, she is grounded by the stark biological reality of her own bleeding. There is no child yet. The symptoms were merely ghosts of her desires, perhaps amplified by the strange, ambient magic of Midworld. But she doesn't mind the role Roland has assigned her for this crucial meeting. She's to remain silent, appearing as nothing more than a docile companion, a shadow wife. It is a tactical deception. By playing the unassuming cripple in a wheelchair, she becomes the ultimate observer, catching every micro-expression and hidden fear that the newcomers might let slip. When the delegation from the borderland town of Calla Bryn Sturgis finally arrives, the psychological lines are immediately drawn. Father Callahan leads the group, flanked by Wayne Overholser, a man whose expensive white hat and deeply etched scowl broadcast his status as the region's wealthy agricultural baron. Overholser is a man entirely accustomed to being the loudest voice in the room. He approaches the gunslingers with a brusque, dismissive arrogance, eager to bypass formal pleasantries and command the situation. He views Roland not as a legendary knight of the Eld, but as a wandering vagrant, a mercenary to be hired and managed. Yet Roland's response is a masterclass in ancient diplomacy and psychological dominance. Where Overholser pushes, Roland yields just enough to make the farmer stumble. The gunslinger employs the high speech of his lost civilization, layering his words with an archaic, unshakable courtesy that completely disarms the wealthy landowner. Roland does not argue. He isolates Overholser, walking him away from the group to let the man vent his terror and his reasons for surrender. It is a brilliant manipulation. Overholser's bluster is merely a brittle shield against his own profound impotence. By the time Roland finishes his quiet, hypnotic negotiation, the farmer who arrived determined to refuse their help has somehow convinced himself to listen. The encounter is a stark reminder that Roland's deadliest weapon has never been his revolvers, but his ancient, predatory patience. Echoes of the old world. The atmosphere briefly softens as the two groups merge and make their way to a hilltop encampment. For the wanderers, who have subsisted on meager woodland scraps, the rancher's feast provided by the townsfolk is a staggering luxury. Roasted meats, fresh corn, and heavy coffee create an illusion of safety. Through quiet conversations with the local farmers, Tian and Zalia Jaffords, a map of this strange region begins to take shape. The Callas are a vast, sprawling arc of pastoral communities, rich in agriculture and surprisingly civilized, governed by town meetings and communal law. But this idyllic borderland is a paradise perched on the edge of an abyss. To the east lies Thunderclap, a horizon choked with perpetual darkness where the world has already ended. It is an epicenter of profound rot, harboring vampires, mutants, and the unthinkable terrors that bleed into the Callas. The most unsettling presence in the camp, however, is not a phantom from Thunderclap, but the entity serving their food. Andy is a towering 7-foot-tall humanoid robot, a gleaming stainless steel relic bearing the horrific insignia of North Central Positronics. His blue optical sensors flash with a sickeningly cheerful subservience as he offers horoscopes and sings jovial tunes. The sheer cognitive dissonance of a high-tech android acting as a campfire cook in a farming community is jarring. When Eddie slips away for a moment in the woods, the robot's cheerful facade fractures. Andy silently materializes behind him, demonstrating a stealth that a machine of his immense bulk has no right to possess. Eddie attempts to interrogate the android about the encroaching threat of the wolves. In an instant, the folksy mechanical servant vanishes. Andy's voice drops into a dead, chillingly cold monotone, demanding a clearance password. When Eddie fails to provide it, the machine cites Directive 19, restricting all strategic data. The psychological horror here is subtle, but immense. The very machine that prepares their meals and entertains their children is hardwired to the catastrophic intelligence of the ancient world. It is a smiling spy, a prisoner of its own corrupt programming, perfectly illustrating how the sins of the old ones continue to govern the misery of the present. The agony of the runt. As the meal concludes, the time for pleasantries expires. Roland demands the truth of the threat they face, and the townsfolk finally unveil the generational trauma that defines their existence. For over a century, the wolves have ridden out from the shadowed nightmare of Thunderclap. They are a terrifying cavalry, clad in green cloaks and metallic wolf masks that rot in the sun like dead flesh. They come armed with the devastating arcane weaponry of the old people, energy weapons that burn flesh to ash, and heat-seeking mechanical drones adorned with invisible, whirring razor blades. But the true horror lies not in the slaughter, but in the harvest. The Callas are biologically anomalous. Twins are birthed almost exclusively. The wolves descend upon the towns to steal one child from every pair. Weeks later, the stolen children are sent back on an automated driverless train, huddled on flat cars, covered in their own filth, and fundamentally destroyed. The townsfolk call them roont. The psychological and physical violation inflicted upon these children is beyond comprehension. They return wiped of their intellect, reduced to babbling, incontinent infants. But the true nightmare begins in their teenage years. The ruined children undergo a grotesque, agonizing biological mutation. Over the course of 18 excruciating months, their bodies explode in size. The parents are forced to listen to the horrifying sounds of their children's bones creaking and stretching in the dead of night. Their skulls expand, pushing against the skin, causing pain so absolute that the afflicted scream for days on end without taking a breath. They morph into towering, sexless giants, hollow shells completely devoid of humanity. By their early 30s, their bodies rapidly decay, riddled with tumors and internal rot, leading to agonizing premature deaths. This revelation hangs over the campfire like a shroud. This is not merely an extortion racket or a raid for resources. It is an existential theft. The wolves are harvesting the minds, the time, and the very humanity of the Calla's children, leaving the parents to endure the psychological torture of watching their offspring transform into monstrous, suffering husks. It is a cycle of grief so profound that it has paralyzed the entire region, breeding a culture of quiet, terrified submission. The deadly catechism. Despite laying bare the darkest wounds of his people, Wayne Overholzer remains tethered to his stubborn, pragmatic cowardice. He understands the agonizing cost of the wolves' raids, but he is equally terrified of resisting. He demands guarantees. He wants to know that these dusty, crippled strangers are truly the legendary protectors of the Eld, capable of slaying an unstoppable mechanized army. He wants the comfort of certainty before he risks the wrath of Thunderclap. Roland's reaction is devoid of anger, replaced instead by the cold, heavy exhaustion of a man who has seen this exact brand of human frailty 1,000 times before. He knows that words will never penetrate the thick armor of a frightened man's denial. He must show them the abyss. Without a flicker of hesitation, Roland calls upon Jake. The transformation is instantaneous and terrifying. The laughing 12-year-old boy who had just been playing with the local children vanishes. In his place stands a cold, ancient instrument of death. As Jake places his hand over his heart, he begins to recite the sacred, bloody catechism of his adopted lineage. He swears to the watching sky that he does not aim with his hand, for that is the path of a man who has forgotten his father's face. He aims with his eye. He shoots with his mind. He kills with his heart. It is a psychological trigger, stripping away the boy's innocence and replacing it with the raw, lethal focus of the gunslinger. With jarring suddenness, Roland hurls 4 thick, grease-stained plates high into the overcast sky. Before the townsfolk can even process the movement, Jake's hand becomes a violent blur. The heavy revolver clears its holster, and the boy fires. The 4 plates detonate into a shower of ceramic shrapnel simultaneously. The air is violently split by the deafening roar of the gunfire, shocking the farmers into cowering terror. But the display of lethal grace does not end with the trigger pull. Operating on pure predatory instinct, Roland, Eddie, and Susanna reach up with blinding speed, snatching the falling razor-sharp shards from the air before they can strike the earth. The silence that follows is suffocating. The people of Calla Bryn Sturgis stare in absolute trembling awe. They realize in this terrifying heartbeat that they have not simply hired a group of mercenaries, they have invited apex predators into their homes. Roland looks down at the terrified farmers, his voice echoing with chilling authority. He informs them that had the plates been the dreaded wolves, 4 of their tormentors would already be rotting on the ground, slaughtered by a mere child. The gunslingers are not a conventional army, but a force of nature. They will evaluate the town. They will decide if it is worthy of defense, and if the townsfolk stand in their way, they will simply walk away. The choice is no longer in the hands of the frightened farmers. The way of the eld has arrived, bringing with it the promise of salvation, paid for only in blood. The burden of 19. In the quiet, fragrant woods outside the farming settlement of Calla Bryn Sturgis, a profound sense of existential dread settles over Eddie Dean. As he sits whittling a wooden top, he watches Roland of Gilead meticulously clean their weapons. They discuss the unsettling apathy of the local townsfolk, who have blindly accepted the arrival of 50 grey horses without a second thought. For Eddie, this passive acceptance is terrifying. It highlights a psychological dissonance that has been gnawing at his sanity. The people of the Calla are so deeply paralyzed by their generational fear of the marauding wolves that they cannot even process anomalies right in front of them. Their terror has bred a willful blindness. But Eddie's anxiety runs much deeper than the psychological trauma of the locals. He is spiraling into a profound crisis of reality. To Eddie, an ex-heroin addict, this entire quest has begun to feel like a narcotic haze. He confesses to Roland that existence itself has become tainted by an overpowering meta-awareness. The number 19 haunts him everywhere. In the clouds, in the flickering campfire, in the very names of the people they meet. Eddie feels as though they have wandered into a fabricated fairy tale, an artificial narrative where civilized townsfolk call upon storybook heroes to vanquish mythical villains. The fabric of reality feels thin, theatrical, and utterly absurd. This unreality is the psychological weight of the Todash state, an interstitial limbo that makes Eddie feel entirely ungrounded. For Roland, however, the stoic acceptance of this absurdity is simply the way of Eld. To the gunslinger, duty and fate are paramount. You do not question the stage you are placed upon, you simply stand true until the final curtain falls. The Horn of Jericho Hill. When sleep finally claims the gunslinger, it brings no rest, only the relentless, cyclical torment of profound survivor's guilt. Roland plunges into a visceral nightmare of Jericho Hill, the apocalyptic final stand of his old life. He is trapped under a suffocating, blood-red sky, fighting a hopeless battle among giant, eroded stone faces. The psychological trauma of this memory is absolute. He relives the senseless, tragic loss of his closest friends. He sees Alain murdered in the dark by friendly fire, and Jamie taken by a sniper. But the most agonizing phantom is Cuthbert Allgood. Cuthbert is dying, his body soaked in his own blood, his eye obliterated, yet he is still laughing. It is a hysterical, desperate laughter that perfectly encapsulates the madness of their final stand against the savage forces of John Farson. Cuthbert clutches the legendary Horn of Eld, blowing a final defiant blast before they charge into certain annihilation. Roland's subconscious forces him to endure the exact moment his world ended, amplifying his deep-seated desire to have died alongside his brothers. He reaches out to grasp Cuthbert's blood-slicked hand, yearning for the peace of a shared death. But instead, the phantom fingers dissolve. He is falling into the void. The agonizing transition from the dusty slaughter of Midworld to the neon-drenched concrete of New York City is heralded by a sound of unspeakable, piercing beauty. The Kamen, the Todash chimes, drag Roland from the ghosts of his past and hurl him directly onto the corner of 2nd Avenue and 54th Street. The divided woman in the neon city. Roland finds himself standing beneath the harsh, artificial glare of a pedestrian crosswalk in 1977 Manhattan. He is entirely alone, surrounded by oblivious crowds, until a voice calls out to him. It is Susanna Dean, running down the street, crying tears of sheer, delirious joy. For the first time since a horrific subway accident decades ago, she has legs. She throws herself at Roland, desperate for him to validate this miraculous physical restoration. But the gunslinger's mind is a steel trap of observation and deduction. As he feels the physical reality of her new limbs, a dark realization solidifies within him. He deliberately calls her Mia. When she fails to notice the slip, Roland's worst fears are confirmed. This is not entirely Susanna. A parasitic, alternate consciousness has hijacked her form, granting her physical wholeness while masking a terrifying maternal hunger. Yet Roland keeps his silence, prioritizing the immediate mission over the horrifying psychological implications of Susanna's divided mind. As they walk, the atmosphere of the city feels suffocating and wrong. The neon lights fail to pierce a palpable spiritual darkness that clings to the avenues. Roland identifies this oppressive dread immediately. It is the radioactive psychic fallout of Black 13. The sinister, corrupting glass sphere hidden beneath the floorboards of a church back in the Calla is the anchor dragging them across dimensions, and its malevolent aura saturates the air. When they reunite with Eddie Jake and the loyal Billy Bumbler Oi, the horror of their situation deepens. Eddie discovers a discarded newspaper, and the date printed on the page delivers a crushing blow. The timeline is accelerating. Time in this reality is moving substantially faster than in Midworld. The psychological pressure of a ticking clock crashes down upon them. Every moment they spend playing local politics in the Calla costs them precious, irretrievable days in New York, pushing them closer to the impending destruction of the vacant lot and the sacred rose within it. The siren song of the rose. Driven by a desperate magnetic pull, the group hurries toward the vacant lot on 46th Street. As they draw closer, a harmonious, celestial humming cuts through the oppressive psychic smog of the city. It is a sound that vibrates with pure benevolence, offering a profound emotional sanctuary to each of them. For Eddie, it evokes the innocent, sun-drenched beaches of his childhood. For Susanna, the comforting scent of her father. For Roland, the lost, sweet grass of Megis. The humming is a divine assurance that despite the chaos, blood and pain of their lives, cosmic order still exists. It whispers that all manner of things shall be well. However, a sudden, instinctual terror grips Susanna. She refuses to climb the wooden fence into the lot, using her bare feet as an excuse. Roland recognizes this not as Susanna's fear, but Mia's. The entity growing inside her possesses a dark, predatory instinct that recoils from the pure, healing light of the rose. Leaving her behind with Oy, the three men cross the threshold into the brick-strewn wasteland. Within the shadows of the urban ruin, the wild rose blooms, and its psychic resonance grants Eddie a staggering vision of the multiverse's hidden architecture. Gazing into its vibrant, sun-like core, he sees a cascade of averted tragedies and quiet mercies. He witnesses lethal accidents narrowly avoided, terrorist plots abandoned over a fleeting glimpse of the sky, and infinite threads of unacknowledged kindness holding existence together. The rose is the metaphysical twin of the Dark Tower itself. It is the earthly anchor of creation, absorbing the collateral damage of a fraying universe. But as they bask in its glory, Eddie and Roland notice a sickening dissonance. A flickering, bruised purple light pulses faintly within the golden center. The rose is fighting a losing battle. The ultimate symbol of hope is sick, infected by the very entropy they are trying to outrun. The vagrant dead and the midnight feast. Outside the fence, Susanna endures a terrifying psychological blackout. Staring at an electric bank clock, she watches helplessly as 7 entire minutes vanish from her memory in the blink of an eye. When her consciousness reboots, her perspective has shifted violently downward. She is sitting in the dirt. Her miraculous legs are gone. The realization that an unseen entity usurped her body, took her on a brief walk, and then vanished back into the depths of her subconscious is a violation so profound it threatens to shatter her sanity. Before she can process this horrifying loss of bodily autonomy, the environment shifts from divine peace to grotesque horror. Drifting through the oblivious crowds of New York are nightmarish anomalies Roland later identifies as the vagrant dead. These are lost souls trapped in the Todash state, refusing to pass on. Susanna watches, paralyzed with dread, as a pale woman with empty black sockets and a green worm crawling from her jaw glides past. Across the street stands a naked man sporting a massive, ragged autopsy incision. A little girl in a sailboat dress wanders aimlessly, her head horrifically crushed from a fatal car accident. The cosmic beauty of the rose is starkly contrasted by the grim, inescapable reality of death that haunts the edges of this liminal space. Susanna's terrified screams rip Eddie, Jake, and Roland away from the rose. As the agonizing, drill-like pitch of the Todash chimes begins to sound, ripping through the minds of the dead and the living alike, the group locks hands. The urban landscape dissolves, hurling them back through the void to the darkened forests of the Calla. When they awaken in the dirt by their campfire, physically exhausted and deeply shaken, Jake discovers a strange artifact clutched in his hand. It is a heavy, metallic bowling bag, identical to the one he owned in his past life, save for a subtle, terrifying alteration in the lettering. It reads Midworld Lanes instead of Midtown Lanes. It is an impossible object, a calculated gift from unseen forces manipulating their path. Roland orders the mysterious bag safely hidden, sensing the encroaching storm of violence they are destined to face. The ka-tet finally succumbs to a restless sleep, their minds still echoing with the divine song of the dying rose. But in the darkest hour of the night, while her protectors dream, the entity known as Mia rises. Guided by an insatiable primal hunger, she slips away into the shadows to gorge herself. The divided woman feasts in secret, unknowingly preparing to bring a new, terrifying variable into a universe already balancing on the edge of the abyss. The echoes of the Eld. There is a profound, almost terrifying strangeness in discovering that you are no longer entirely who you thought you were. For a young man raised in the concrete labyrinth of Brooklyn, a man whose previous life was defined by the desperate chemical hunger of heroin and the suffocating shadow of an older brother, the simple act of approaching a saddled horse should have been a moment of clumsy humiliation. Yet, as the unlikely company prepares to ride into the settlement of Calla Bryn Sturgis, an eerie serenity washes over this former addict. He does not fumble. He does not hesitate. When a local boy attempts to adjust his stirrups, the knowledge of how to manipulate the leather and iron blooms in his mind with the effortless clarity of a deeply ingrained habit. This is not mere adaptation. It is an existential haunting. The lingering spectre of ancestral memory, the bloodline of Arthur Eld, is asserting its ancient authority over his modern soul. The psychological implication is staggering. It forces us to ask, how much of our identity is truly our own, and how much is merely a vessel waiting to be filled by the relentless, cyclical forces of destiny? The concept of reincarnation within the sprawling, decaying reality of Midworld is not offered as a comforting spiritual embrace, but rather as a chilling erasure of the individual self, subsumed by the cosmic demands of the white. Alongside him, another tragedy of stolen innocence plays out in quiet, heartbreaking subtlety. The youngest member of their traveling family, a boy who has endured psychological torment and physical brutality in realms far beyond his years, finds himself engaging in brief, hesitant moments of ordinary childhood with a local boy. The gunslinger, their scarred and relentless leader, watches this interaction with a heavy, unspoken sorrow. He recognizes the terrible irony of their situation. He has methodically stripped away the boy's youth, forging him into a lethal instrument of survival, yet he silently prays that a fragment of that lost boyhood might still be salvaged in the fleeting sanctuary of a local ranch. It is a brilliant, devastating portrait of a commander who is fully aware of the moral compromises he has made, carrying the guilt of weaponizing a child, while simultaneously knowing it is the only way to keep them all alive. As the travelers emerge from the dense foliage, the landscape of Calla Bryn Sturgis unfolds beneath them in a striking tableau of contradictions. To the west, the fertile earth yields a vibrant bounty of rice paddies, rich soil, and thriving livestock, a testament to life, resilience, and the desperate hope of an agrarian society. But this pastoral beauty is a fragile illusion, violently juxtaposed against the eastern horizon. There, the sky is swallowed by a towering, oppressive wall of suffocating blackness. This is the land of Thunderclap, the origin point of the apocalyptic terrors that periodically ravage the town. The visual contrast serves as a stark geographical metaphor for the psychological state of the townsfolk, living in a state of precarious, agonizing abundance, while dwelling in the perpetual shadow of their own inevitable doom. Riding into the town itself is an exercise in escalating dread. The streets are unnervingly empty, echoing with the muffled thud of hooves against hard-packed dirt. For our travelers, who have navigated the treacherous, violent ruins of fallen cities and parallel dimensions, this profound silence is deeply unsettling. It carries the distinct metallic taste of a trap. When they finally reach the town pavilion, illuminated by the flickering, oily glare of iron-caged torches, they are met by a sea of silent, weathered faces. The air is thick with the suffocating weight of generational trauma. These are people who have been historically conditioned to surrender their most precious resource, their children, to the nightmarish marauders of Thunderclap. They are trapped in a cycle of learned helplessness, and the arrival of armed strangers introduces a terrifying variable into their fatalistic arithmetic, Will these warriors be their salvation, or will they merely agitate the monsters and bring absolute ruin upon them all? The introduction of the travelers is a masterclass in psychological manipulation and charismatic diplomacy. The stoic leader, possessing a deep understanding of human nature, orchestrates the moment perfectly, even allowing their unusually intelligent animal companion to perform a startling, dignified bow that shatters the crowd's paralyzing tension. But the true crucible falls upon the young man from New York, who is unexpectedly thrust into the role of the group's statesman. Standing before hundreds of desperate, analyzing eyes, he must channel both the street-smart bravado of a city hustler and the quiet, lethal authority of a seasoned lawman. His speech is a delicate tightrope walk. He offers no grand cinematic promises of guaranteed victory, recognizing that false hope is a poison. Instead, he speaks of harsh realities, utilizing an intuitive emotional intelligence to demand that if the town wishes to be saved, they must summon the courage to bleed for their own salvation. Yet not all are swayed by this pragmatic honesty. The festering rot of cowardice is perfectly encapsulated in the skepticism of a wealthy silver-haired rancher who corners the young diplomat. This local aristocrat masks his fear of the impending conflict behind a veil of condescending pragmatism and logistical interrogations. He represents a horrifying but entirely human psychological defense mechanism. The willingness to sacrifice the innocent in order to maintain a comfortable status quo. He would rather watch his neighbor's children be dragged into the abyss than risk the destruction of his own prosperity. It is a chilling reminder that in the face of absolute evil, the greatest obstacle is often the banal, self-serving apathy of those who refuse to stand. As the night deepens, the suffocating tension of the pavilion gradually dissolves into the cathartic release of a communal feast. The air grows thick with the intoxicating fumes of hard liquor and the haunting, beautiful melodies of local ballads, songs steeped in loss, endurance, and the ache of survival. But the emotional zenith of the evening arrives in an event of staggering, almost surreal intensity. The grim, emotionally impenetrable gunslinger, a man who has spent lifetimes suppressing his humanity beneath a hardened shell of duty and violence, steps forward to dance. Driven by the furious, accelerating rhythm of a traditional agricultural chant, he surrenders completely to the visceral, primal energy of the moment. His boots strike the wooden floor in a frantic, hypnotic cadence that mirrors the hidden pulse of the universe itself. It is not merely a dance, it is an exorcism. For a fleeting, euphoric moment, the burden of his endless, bloody quest is cast aside, culminating in a breathless, spectacular leap into the cheering crowd. It is a startling display of raw life from a man who walks hand in hand with death, serving as a desperate reminder of exactly what it is they are fighting to preserve. The secret rot of Gilead, the euphoric adrenaline of the previous night's communal revelry, is a fleeting ghost, brutally dispelled by the arrival of a cold and unforgiving dawn. For the last lord of the ancient realm, the morning does not bring the quiet peace of rest, but rather the agonizing, fiery bite of physical decay. He awakens in the grip of a relentless, localized torment, a sharp, radiating agony encircling his hips, knees, and ankles. He recognizes this insidious enemy immediately, referring to it by an archaic term from his youth, the dry twist. It is severe, fast-moving arthritis. For a man whose entire existence, whose very utility to the fabric of the universe, relies on the unparalleled speed, precision, and endurance of his physical form. This diagnosis is a psychological nightmare. It is the ultimate indignity. He can outdraw a demon, he can outmaneuver an ambush, but he cannot shoot his way out of the slow, inevitable calcification of his own bones. There is a profound thematic tragedy woven into his deteriorating joints. As the multiverse around him slowly breaks down, its boundaries fraying and its fundamental laws unraveling. The body of its ultimate protector is mirroring that same entropic collapse. He is the anchor holding reality together, but the anchor itself is rusting away in the dark. Driven by the deeply ingrained, isolating stoicism of leadership, he resolves to hide his agonizing vulnerability from his companions. He understands that to show weakness now, on the precipice of a devastating conflict, would invite a lethal crack in their collective morale. He secures a temporary, deeply unpleasant alchemical remedy from a perceptive local woman, a violently potent oil derived from the bile of desert predators. It is a desperate, burning reprieve, a way to borrow just a little more time from an unforgiving cosmic clock. But the physical rot afflicting the gunslinger is entirely eclipsed by a psychological horror of unimaginable proportions gestating within the group. Under the guise of a mundane morning task, gathering wild berries in the chill air, the leader corners his young apprentice from New York to deliver a revelation that shatters the fragile illusion of their safety. The young man's beloved, the woman who has become the emotional core of their makeshift family, is pregnant. However, the entity growing within her womb is entirely devoid of human origin. It is a parasitic abomination, an ancient demonic intrusion that scorns biological norms and hungers for unnatural sustenance. The psychological violation inherent in this revelation is almost too immense to process. This woman has already survived the catastrophic fracturing of her own mind, having spent years battling a vicious dual personality disorder forged in the fires of intense trauma. She has fought tirelessly to integrate her fractured psyche into a cohesive, empowered whole. Now that hard-won autonomy is being subverted on a terrifyingly biological level. A third consciousness, an ancient, maternal force of chaotic intent, is hijacking her body, manipulating her cravings, and threatening to obliterate her identity to protect the monstrous life feeding on her vitality. It is an invasion of the most intimate, horrifying kind, echoing the raw, predatory evil of the chaotic void that predates creation itself. The ensuing conversation between the aging gunslinger and the young man is a chilling study in the ethical bankruptcy required for absolute survival. The leader coldly articulates a pragmatic, deeply disturbing strategy. They must keep this horrifying truth a secret from the woman carrying the creature. To inform her would trigger a psychological collapse, or worse, awaken the fiercely protective demonic consciousness within her, rendering her useless as a combatant when the town needs her lethal skills the most. He is calculating her value strictly as a weapon, deliberately suppressing her right to her own bodily autonomy in service of the overarching mission. Here, the psychological evolution of the young New Yorker is put on stark, devastating display. In his previous life, such a revelation would have ignited a spectacular, explosive rage, a desperate, chaotic rejection of authority. But the crucible of their journey has fundamentally altered his psychological architecture. The young man absorbs the horrifying reality of his lover's possession, internalizes the agonizing grief of a corrupted future, and agrees to the lie. He accepts the burden of complicity. He chooses the survival of the universe and the immediate survival of the terrified town over the immediate emotional well-being of the woman he loves. It is a heartbreaking transition from a rebellious survivor to a hardened general. He is slowly, inevitably becoming a reflection of his stoic leader, ruthless, emotionally compartmentalized, and willing to sacrifice the individual upon the altar of destiny. They are bound by a terrible, unspoken pact, united in a conspiracy of silence that threatens to erode their humanity from the inside out. The immense, abstract weight of their ethical compromise is suddenly given a beautiful, heartbreaking face. As they return toward the rectory, they are introduced to a pair of local siblings, twins of such startling, flawless beauty and piercing, luminous intelligence that they seem almost ethereal. They possess the kind of vibrant, unblemished potential that makes the heart ache. Their appearance is a deliberate, agonizing psychological tactic orchestrated by the local priest. He wants the warriors to look into the bright, curious eyes of these perfect children and understand exactly what the monsters from Thunderclap are coming to steal. The twins stand as a devastating visual representation of the town's impending loss. Without violent, uncompromising intervention, these vibrant minds will be dragged into the eastern dark, returning as hollowed-out, grotesque husks of their former selves, stripped of their intellect and their humanity. The sheer injustice of their potential fate solidifies the dark resolve of the warriors. Looming silently in the background of this quiet domestic tragedy is the local house of worship. It is a simple, unassuming structure of timber and faith, yet it radiates an aura of oppressive, suffocating malice. Hidden within its walls sleeps an artifact of pure, concentrated evil, a sentient sphere of darkness that predates the town, the priest, and the modern world itself. It is a supernatural gravity well, subtly warping the spiritual atmosphere of the settlement. The men stand in the crisp morning air, their bodies battered by disease, their minds burdened by monstrous secrets, and their souls preparing to hear the tragic, alcohol-soaked history of a priest who crossed dimensions just to find himself standing at the end of the world. They are surrounded by rot, the rot in the joints, the rot in the womb, and the rot sleeping in the church. Yet they stand firm, waiting for the storm to break. The magic elephant and the broken faith. It is a profound and terrifying truth that the descent into spiritual ruin rarely begins with a grand cosmic battle between good and evil. For Father Callahan, the unraveling of his soul did not start with demons or the devil, but with the quiet, mundane seduction of whiskey. Looking back from the clarity of absolute sobriety, he realized that his so-called spiritual crises were merely the desperate justifications of a chemical dependency. He had moved from a Boston seminary to Lowell, Massachusetts, and eventually to the suburban quiet of Ohio, carrying his inner darkness with him. He masked his drinking with the sophisticated buzzwords of the era, speaking to his superiors of anomie and urban malaise. He convinced himself and them that he was drinking because he was spiritually unmoored. The psychological reality, however, was far more brutal. He was spiritually unmoored because he was blindingly drunk. Addiction is the ultimate illusionist. It is a dark sleight of hand, the magic elephant in the living room, possessing the uncanny power to cloud a man's mind, tricking him into believing his problems are existential rather than liquid. Callahan's search for a rural, restorative parish eventually led him to the seemingly idyllic town of Jerusalem's Lot, Maine. But instead of finding God, he found a mirror to his own corrupted spirit. He met true ancient evil in the form of Kurt Barlow, a master vampire. A small group of believers, a writer named Ben Mears, a teacher, and a brave young boy named Mark Petrie, tried to warn the town. But the encroaching darkness was absolute. The atmosphere in the Lot became thick with an unspeakable, suffocating terror. People simply began to vanish. The psychological breaking point for Callahan arrived during a fateful confrontation in the Petrie family kitchen. Barlow had murdered the boy's parents, crushing their skulls, and now held the child hostage. In a surge of righteous power, Callahan raised his holy crucifix. The cross glowed with a blinding divine light, pushing the ancient monster back. In that fleeting second, Callahan held the raw, surging voltage of true faith. But Barlow was a creature of immense psychological cunning. He recognized the rot inside the priest. The vampire challenged Callahan to a Mexican standoff. Put away the physical symbol of the cross and face him with faith alone. God help him, Callahan agreed. The moment the challenge was accepted, the illusion shattered. Without the crutch of the artifact, Callahan's internal reservoir of belief was exposed as entirely empty, hollowed out by years of choosing the bottle over the Bible. The glowing cross dimmed into a cheap, lifeless piece of tourist plaster. Barlow snatched it, snapping it in two, the sound echoing like the breaking of Callahan's very soul. In a moment of supreme, cosmic mockery, as the undead monster reached for him, Callahan's only thought was a desperate craving for a drink. Barlow did not kill him. Death would have been a mercy. Instead, the vampire forced the priest to drink his corrupted, dead blood. It was the ultimate defilement. Callahan had sought salvation, but in the end he consumed the communion of the damned. The mark of the exiled. Barlow's blood fundamentally altered Callahan's physiology and his soul. The vampire let him live because the psychological torture of survival was far more agonizing than the peace of the grave. Callahan was allowed to wander through a town that was rapidly dissolving into a nightmare, an epicenter of a supernatural plague. The newly turned townsfolk ignored him. Barlow had placed a psychic mark upon the priest, branding him as untouchable, much like the mark God placed upon Cain before casting him into the wasteland. Desperate for a second chance, Callahan sought sanctuary in his own church. He fled to the steps of St. Andrew's, praying not to the modern, abstract concept of the divine, but to the vengeful, ancient God of the Old Testament. Yet when he reached for the iron handle of the church door, the building itself violently rejected him. A surge of supernatural fire blasted from the metal, throwing him backward and leaving a hideous, permanent scar across his right hand. It was a physical manifestation of his spiritual excommunication. He was no longer a priest, he was a pariah. Fleeing the town, Callahan purchased a Greyhound bus ticket to New York City. The journey was a descent into a modern purgatory. During a bleak pre-dawn rest stop in Hartford, the desperate craving for alcohol clawed at his mind. The taste of the vampire's blood, a foul, rotting flavor like spoiled meat, lingered in his mouth. He bribed the bus driver $30 to buy him a cheap pint of whiskey, needing the poison to mask the trauma. As the bus rolled toward Manhattan, Callahan felt the eerie pull of America's secret highways, a hidden network of dark roads calling out to the lost and the broken. When he finally stepped into the Port Authority under the harsh, clinical glare of fluorescent lights, he looked at the drifters, the addicts, and the nightwalkers. He realized then that the undead were not just monsters with fangs. They were the forgotten souls wandering the concrete labyrinth of the city. The blue light of the parasite. Callahan's early days in New York were spent in a drunken, homeless stupor. He slept under newspapers in Washington Square Park, narrowly avoiding the violence of roaming street gangs. Yet even in his degradation, a part of him yearned for atonement. He eventually found his way to a shelter called Home, managed by a compassionate man named Rowan Magruder and his dedicated right-hand man, Lupe Delgado. The shelter had a unique, merciful policy. They didn't turn away the hopelessly intoxicated. They simply took their alcohol, placed them in a safe room, and administered measured doses to prevent the lethal shock of sudden withdrawal. Callahan began working at the shelter, slowly sobering up and immersing himself in the grueling but grounding work of serving others. However, as his mind cleared, the cursed blood of Kurt Barlow began to awaken within him. He developed a horrifying sixth sense. He began to hear an otherworldly, sickly sweet chiming in his head. He would smell the phantom, acrid stench of roasted onions mixed with hot metal, and most terrifying of all, he began to see a dark, swirling blue aura radiating from certain individuals. Through this cursed perception, Callahan realized that the world was infested with Type 3 vampires. If Barlow was a Type 1, an ancient, powerful progenitor, and the mindless ghouls of Salem's lot were Type 2s, these Type 3s were the parasites of the city. They were supernatural mosquitoes. They walked in the daylight, blended into society, and fed silently on the vulnerable. Their saliva contained an amnesiac enzyme, ensuring their victims never remembered the feeding. During his months at the shelter, Callahan found himself falling deeply in love with Lupe Delgado. It was a pure, restorative affection for a man whose physical beauty was matched only by his selfless dedication to the poor. But tragedy is the inescapable gravity of Callahan's life. One damp April night, while preparing a meal, Callahan stepped into the alley behind the shelter and witnessed a nightmare. A well-dressed Type 3 vampire was feeding on Lupe. The blue aura pulsed rhythmically with the creature's breathing. In that moment, Callahan experienced a profound psychological detachment. He did not scream or panic. He calmly stepped back into the kitchen, picked up a heavy, gleaming meat cleaver, and returned to the alley. With a terrifying, calculated precision, he buried the blade deep into the vampire's skull. The creature did not bleed a human ocean. Instead, it simply withered, its flesh and bones turning to dust, leaving nothing behind but an empty suit, a briefcase, and a pair of expensive shoes. Lupe awoke from the trance completely unaware of the violation, bearing only faint, fading pinpricks on his neck. Callahan disposed of the supernatural remains with the chilling efficiency of a man who had finally found a dark, violent purpose to replace his lost priesthood. He vowed to become a silent guardian, to protect the man he loved from the shadows. The crimson stalkers of the grid. But Callahan's protection was not enough. The narrative of Stephen King's universe often hinges on the devastating intersection of supernatural malice and fragile human reality. The vampire had not killed Lupe directly, but it had passed on a microscopic doom. It was the mid-1970s, years before the world would understand the plague of AIDS, but Lupe contracted the aggressively fatal virus from the creature's bite. The psychological torment of watching Lupe deteriorate, his skin marred by disfiguring lesions, his body consumed by fever, shattered Callahan's hard-won peace. When Lupe finally died in a sterile hospital room, pleading that he had been entirely clean of drugs, Callahan's fragile sobriety broke. The grief and the sheer cosmic injustice of Lupe's death drove the former priest straight back to the bottle. He plunged into a massive, reality-bending binge. Drifting through the neon-lit canyons of Park Avenue, his intoxication merged dangerously with his supernatural sight. The psychic veil of the world tore open, plunging him briefly into what is known as the toe-dash space, the dark, chaotic void existing between dimensions. In this terrifying state of hyper-awareness, Callahan saw the vagrant dead, the mangled, lost spirits of the city who had not passed on. They stared at him with empty, pleading eyes, recognizing him as a man caught between the world of the living and the abyss of the damned. Callahan survived the horror of that night, but his life devolved into a grim cycle. Throughout the suffocating summer of 1976, he worked grueling day labor jobs, drank himself into oblivion, and hunted. He became a vigilante of the hidden world, stalking the Type 3 vampires through the parks and alleys of Manhattan. He grew dangerously efficient, slipping his fold-out knife into their spines, watching them dissolve into empty clothes. He justified the slaughter as an act of atonement, a bloody penance for the cowardice he had shown in Jerusalem's lot. Yet the psychology of the hunter inevitably shifts when he realizes he has become the prey. As the summer waned, Callahan noticed a creeping, systemic paranoia setting in. He was being watched. He began finding cryptic graffiti spray-painted on the benches of Washington Square Park and the brick walls of the village. The messages were chillingly specific. He comes here. He has a burned hand. Soon, the psychological warfare escalated to innocent-looking, lost pet posters plastered across his regular haunts, mocking him by describing a stray dog with white hair and a mutilated right paw. Callahan quickly deduced that his pursuers were not the mindless dead, nor the parasitic vampires. They were an entirely different breed of predator. They were the low men. terrifying regulators who often wore long yellow coats and bore the tattoos of blue coffins upon their hands. These entities were the sinister foot soldiers of a cosmic dictator known as the Crimson King, recognizable by their unnerving blood-red eyes. The realization that this vast, multidimensional intelligence had mobilized against him forced Callahan to make a desperate choice. Knowing that remaining in New York would endanger everyone at the shelter, especially Rowan Magruder, Callahan chose exile once again. He understood that the city was anchored by hidden Todash turnpikes, secret, magical pathways that radiated outward, invisible to the ordinary eye, but accessible to those touched by the supernatural. As he recounted this harrowing history to the gunslinger Roland and his companions Eddie and Susanna, Callahan recognized the gravity of his journey. His path from a drunken, broken priest to an interdimensional wanderer was paved with the ashes of his faith and the blood of the undead. And as he looked toward the looming dark mountains of Thunderclap, he knew the forces of the Crimson King were still waiting, their red eyes burning in the dark, ready to claim the soul they had been hunting across the fabric of reality. The highways in hiding. The distance between the rectory and the humble doors of Our Lady of Serenity is a remarkably short one, a mere 5-minute stroll. Yet in the strange, time-bending reality of those bound by a shared, inescapable destiny, it is more than enough time for a lifetime of trauma to be unspooled. For the gunslinger and his companions, listening to the elderly priest recount his years of wandering is not simply an act of hearing a story. It is a profound spiritual binding. They are sharing a metaphysical water, forging a connection that confirms they are inextricably locked together by fate. The priest, Father Callahan, begins to peel back the layers of his lost years, starting with the moment he realized he had stepped entirely out of the world he knew. He speaks of crossing a footbridge over the Hudson River, leaving the supernatural horrors of Jerusalem's lot and the sprawling concrete of Manhattan behind him. But as he steps off the wooden planks, he does not find the familiar landscape of New Jersey. Instead, he finds himself in a town called Leabrook, a place that does not exist in any conventional geography. He finds a discarded newspaper with headlines that fracture his understanding of reality. Spiro Agnew is the president, and the text is written in Cyrillic. For a man who has just survived a harrowing encounter with vampires, this quiet, sunlit displacement is somehow far more terrifying. It is the psychological breaking point where the mind must either accept the impossible or completely shatter. Callahan chooses to simply discard the paper and keep walking. He realizes, with a chilling, instinctual clarity, that America is not a single, solid entity. It is a fragile stack of infinite, overlapping realities. There are hidden highways running through these parallel worlds, and he has stumbled directly onto them. What follows is a mesmerizing, deeply tragic descent into a transient existence. He becomes a ghost, haunting the margins of 1,000 different Americas. He takes menial jobs, flipping eggs in diners, sweeping floors, digging graves. He measures the shifting realities by the color of the motel bedspreads and the unfamiliar faces printed on the currency. Sometimes Abraham Lincoln is on the $50 bill. Sometimes it is a man he has never heard of. The psychological toll of this limitless freedom is devastating. To cope with the existential dread of being entirely unmoored from a singular reality, Callahan drowns himself in alcohol. The road itself becomes a far more potent and dangerous addiction than the liquor. He is adrift in a vast, shifting ocean of possibilities, yet he is constantly hunted. He begins to see the predators of the multiverse, tall, watchful entities disguised in long yellow dusters and low-pulled hats. These low men possess eyes that flare with a violent, animalistic red in the shadows. They communicate through insidious means, leaving seemingly innocent lost pet posters plastered on telephone poles that are actually coded messages tracking his movements. Callahan learns to survive by slipping through the cracks of reality just before the yellow-coated men can close their snare, existing in a state of perpetual, exhausting paranoia. His endless flight continues until the spring of 1981, when he finds himself in Sacramento, California, working a grueling day labor job. While taking a lunch break with a group of undocumented workers, he is handed a newspaper. Amidst the mundane tragedies of the world, a single article pierces his alcohol-soaked apathy. It details the brutal torture of an old friend, a man who ran a shelter back in his original New York. The man had been mutilated, blinded, and branded with a swastika by a vicious gang. Reading this, a profound, crushing shame breaks through Callahan's psychological defenses. He realizes that while he has been fleeing through the hidden turnpikes of the multiverse, hiding from his fears and numbing his conscience, the real world has continued to suffer. The illusion of his endless escape collapses, replaced by a desperate, agonizing need to return and face the consequences of his absence. The slumbering void. By the time the harrowing tale concludes, the group arrives at the steps of the modest wooden church. The gunslinger, operating with a cold, protective paranoia, insists that his companions remain outside in the fading sunlight. He is deeply wary of the pregnant woman in their group, or rather, he is terrified of the dark, parasitic consciousness that has taken root inside her mind. He knows that the artifact hidden within the church is a conduit of unimaginable dark energy, and he refuses to risk allowing that malevolent force to feed the entity gestating within her. This decision highlights the profound psychological isolation the gunslinger endures. He is a man forced to constantly calculate the potential betrayals and vulnerabilities of the very people he has sworn to protect. Following the priest into the quiet, floral-scented sanctuary, the gunslinger is immediately struck by a sensory paradox. The room looks like a place of humble, ordinary worship, complete with wooden pews and an ironwood cross. But beneath the scent of white flowers, he feels a catastrophic vibration in his very bones. It is not merely a sound, but a heavy, oppressive drone that radiates a colossal emptiness. It is the signature of a void so deep and absolute that it threatens to swallow the mind whole. The gunslinger, a man who has faced monsters, warlords, and the decay of his entire civilization, feels an ancient primal fear wash over him. The priest, equally terrified, moves to the raised platform and pries away a section of the floorboards, revealing a secret compartment. Inside rests an object wrapped carefully in the fine white linen of an altar boy's garment, a desperate, faithful attempt to smother an unholy presence. Beneath the cloth is a heavy box carved from black ironwood, a dense, ancient material that feels like lightly oiled metal against the skin. The wood seems to absorb the light around it, emanating a ghostly, displaced aura, as if it is an object that has survived the death of countless universes. Carved into the lid of the box are three distinct symbols: a rose, a stone, and a door. Beneath them is a single chilling word that the gunslinger reads not with his eyes, but through the sensitive touch of his scarred fingertips. The word is unfound. As he traces the carvings, the dreadful hum beneath the wood swells, projecting an image of a monstrous crawling hive. The artifact hidden inside the box, a sentient, malefic sphere of dark glass, seems to stir in its sleep. For a fleeting, horrifying second, the physical walls of the church seem to waver, and the gunslinger hears the grinding, discordant chime of invisible bells. It is a psychic projection from the entity within, a mocking whisper designed to show them the ultimate, crushing insignificance of their lives against the backdrop of eternity. Shaken but resolute, the gunslinger promises the desperate priest that he will remove the cursed object soon, though his heart dreads the moment that transfer must occur. The Lady of the Plate. Later that evening, the heavy, muggy twilight settles over a sprawling cattle ranch on the edge of the town. The gunslinger sits on the back porch with the wealthy ranch owner, engaging in the quiet, methodical work of disassembling and oiling antique firearms. The rancher's weapons are beautiful family heirlooms, passed down through generations, but to the gunslinger's experienced eye, they are hopelessly obsolete and mechanically useless against the impending mechanical threat. In the dusty yard below, a brief illusion of peace plays out as two young boys take turns swinging from a barn loft into a massive pile of hay, their laughter ringing out in the cooling air. Yet this idyllic pastoral scene is deeply shadowed by the oppressive, unspoken terror that dictates the lives of everyone in the valley. The rancher embodies the agonizing psychological paralysis of the town. He possesses resources and influence, yet he is vehemently opposed to fighting back. To stand and fight means risking total annihilation. To submit means enduring a slow generational death. This tragic calculus is laid bare when the rancher's wife steps onto the porch. With a voice trembling with decades of repressed grief, she reveals the devastating cost of their supposed safety. She has given birth to 6 children, 3 sets of twins, and the raiding entities have taken every single one of them. To protect their future descendants from the same horrific fate, all of her surviving altered children have fled to the far corners of the land. The psychological wound of this absolute maternal loss is palpable, a raw, bleeding trauma that has transformed her grief into a sharp, suppressed fury. Sensing the gunslinger's need for a viable defense, she brings forth the region's most deeply guarded secret, framing it first through a legendary local myth. She recounts the tale of an ancient heroine who sought vengeance against a notoriously arrogant outlaw who had murdered her father. The heroine invited the warlord to a private, naked banquet, an act of psychological warfare designed to disarm him completely. The warlord, blinded by his own lust and immense ego, assumed he was safe because neither could conceal a traditional weapon. He severely underestimated the lethal ingenuity of a woman consumed by righteous hatred. The heroine had spent weeks mastering the art of throwing a specially forged, razor-sharp dinner plate. At the height of the banquet, she hurled the modified dish with such ferocious precision that it decapitated the outlaw before he even registered the movement. The myth is not merely a story, it is a blueprint for survival. The rancher's wife slowly pulls her hand from beneath her apron, revealing a stunning, deadly tool. It is a plate, roughly a foot in diameter, forged from lightweight, indestructible titanium, salvaged from ancient northern ruins. The edges are honed to a suicidal keenness, save for one specific, dull gripping point marked by a delicate engraving of crossing rice stalks. It is a domestic object subverted into a terrifying instrument of war. To prove her claim, the gunslinger challenges her to demonstrate her skill. The woman marches into the fading red light of the yard, her face pale, her lips pulled back in a fierce, trembling snarl. She targets a potato resting on the shoulder of a scarecrow by the barn doors. As she draws her arm back, she releases a shrill, furious battle cry, unleashing a lifetime of stolen motherhood and helpless terror into the throw. The metal disc rips through the twilight air with a haunting, whistling howl, slicing the target perfectly in half before burying itself deep into the thick wood of the barn. The display is awe-inspiring, a visceral manifestation of repressed trauma erupting into lethal pinpoint violence. A profound tactical epiphany washes over the gunslinger. The men of this valley, with their clumsy bows and useless antique revolvers, are not the warriors he needs. The true hidden teeth of this community belong to the women. He immediately begins to weave a strategy, demanding a secret nighttime gathering of the town's most skilled female throwers. However, his mind is already calculating variables far beyond the lethal geometry of the flying metal plates. He understands that the impending battle will not be won entirely by force, but by deception. Inviting the ranch foreman into the office, the gunslinger deliberately unveils a fabricated tactical map. He outlines a false, desperate plan to hide the town's children in a dead-end garnet mine in the northern hills, a location perfectly suited to trap anyone foolish enough to seek refuge there. He watches the foreman's reaction closely, knowing that the man will spread this lie. The gunslinger has realized a chilling truth. The town's absolute inability to resist the raids is not just a matter of fear, but of espionage. There is a traitor among them, a leak feeding information to their enemies. As the darkness fully claims the ranch, the gunslinger accepts the crushing weight of his ultimate isolation. He cannot trust his closest friends. He cannot trust the grieving parents, and he must wage a psychological war of misinformation entirely on his own, using the very children he intends to save as phantom bait in a deadly high-stakes game of shadows. The illusion of peace. For a man raised amidst the concrete canyons and roaring subways of New York City, the rustic tranquility of the Jaffords' riverside homestead offers a deeply seductive illusion. Eddie Dean looks upon the sturdy, weather-tight log cabin and the sprawling, hand-tilled gardens, and for a fleeting moment he allows himself to imagine a life of quiet domesticity. This psychological yearning is a common defense mechanism for those perpetually at war. The mind desperately seeks an anchor, a fantasy of normalcy to ward off the encroaching dread. Yet, beneath the quaint surface of pecking chickens and vibrant yellow crops of madrigal, the true, agonizing cost of living in this borderland is laid bare in the form of the local children. The sheer volume of offspring is staggering, but it is the eerie prevalence of twins that serves as a constant living reminder of the town's curse. This biological anomaly is not a blessing, but a cruel stocking of the pantry for an enemy that operates on a grotesque, unfathomable schedule. The burden of the ruined. The reality of the wolves' harvest is fully realized when Eddie and Susanna are introduced to Tian's siblings. They are towering, hulking figures, stretching towards the sky with absurd proportions, yet their minds have been scraped utterly hollow. They are what the locals call roont, a bastardized, tragic term for ruined. To look upon these gentle, drooling giants is to gaze into the abyss of the enemy's cruelty. The wolves do not simply steal children, they perform a dark alchemy, extracting the essence of humanity and returning nothing but oversized, instinct-driven husks. Eddie's modern sensibilities are profoundly shocked when he learns that Tian harnesses his own sister to a plow to drag it through the treacherous rocky soil of his worst field. Yet this is not an act of malice, but a stark illustration of frontier pragmatism. In a world teetering on the edge of collapse, where highly advanced robots refuse manual labor based on esoteric programming directives, survival demands that even the deepest tragedies be put to utilitarian use. It is a harsh, unsettling coping mechanism that forces Eddie to confront the sheer desperation of the people he has sworn to protect. The magic of the dust. Despite the overarching gloom, the human spirit exhibits a terrifying resilience, capable of carving out moments of profound joy in the very shadow of the gallows. This is beautifully captured in the dooryard as the massive, ruined siblings rhythmically swing a long rope and the rest of the group partakes in a frantic, laughter-filled skipping game. For a few suspended minutes, the generational trauma, the impending invasion, and the interdimensional burdens are eclipsed by the simple, hypnotic slap of rope against dirt. Eddie, matching steps with the matriarch of the family while reciting half-remembered childhood chants, experiences a unifying magic that requires no portals or psychic phenomena. It is the raw connective tissue of shared humanity. Such moments are vital in narratives of despair. They remind the characters, and the audience precisely what is at stake. They are fighting not just to survive, but to preserve the capacity for this innocent, unadulterated joy. The Old Man and the Slaughter. Following a massive communal feast of roasted meat and seemingly endless bowls of root vegetables and rice, the haunting lore of the Calla is unspooled by its oldest living resident. Grandpère Jamie is a man whose mind is a decaying labyrinth, fractured by age and senility, yet the trauma of his youth remains etched into his psyche with terrifying clarity. Memory is often unreliable, but the visceral horror of absolute violence burns away the fog of time. He recounts a day decades past, when he and 3 companions, driven by the fearless, foolish adrenaline of youth and the suffocating grief of lost relatives, dared to barricade a road against the approaching nightmare. The ensuing skirmish strips away the mythological dread of the wolves, revealing them instead as harbingers of cold, mechanized devastation. Jamie describes their horrifying arsenal, explosive, homing spheres that hunt their targets with buzzing malevolence and energy blades that ignite unquenchable, ravenous fires. He witnesses the instantaneous, explosive death of his friends and the fierce, doomed defiance of a red-haired woman who manages to fell one of the riders with a razor-sharp, ceremonially decorated throwing plate before she is consumed by unnatural flames. The truth beneath the hood. Survival, in this instance, is born of sheer, paralyzing terror. Jamie recounts lying in a ditch, soaked in the vaporized remains of his closest friend, feigning death as the metallic hooves thunder past. When the dust settles, the traumatized youth manages to destroy a lingering, exhausted explosive sphere before approaching the solitary fallen enemy. It is here that the psychological foundation of the Calla's fear is irrevocably altered. Jamie pulls back the rotting, melting mesh of the creature's mask and gazes upon the truth. Leaning in close, the old man whispers a secret of 19 syllables to Eddie, a burden he has carried in silence for a lifetime, out of a paralyzing fear of retribution. The revelation strikes Eddie like a physical blow. The identical grey garments, the synchronized movements, the unnatural mounts. It suddenly forms a cohesive, terrifying picture. The enemy is not a pack of supernatural demons, but a mechanized, militaristic force. It is a revelation that grounds the terror in a cold, industrial reality, fundamentally changing the nature of the upcoming war. The starving parasite. While Eddie wrestles with the grim realities of the waking world, a far more insidious horror is unfolding in the fractured landscape of the mind. Susanna's consciousness has been violently usurped by the entity known as Mia. We follow this spectral hijacker through the decaying, opulent halls of a ghostly, forgotten castle. What drives Mia is not malice, but a ravenous, biological imperative that borders on madness. She is consumed by a hunger that transcends mere sustenance. It is the frantic, demanding void of an otherworldly pregnancy, the entity's desperate search for specific nutrients to trigger her dark labor, is a grotesque subversion of the maternal instinct. When she finally breaches a ruined, critter-infested kitchen, the sheer depravity of her condition is fully realized. She discovers a massive bloated rat feasting upon a roasted pig, a piece of meat that, in her fevered state, initially resembles a human infant. Driven by pure predatory dominance, she skewers the squirming rodent with a meat fork, tosses it into stagnant water, and buries her face in the scorched flesh of the pig. It is a terrifying portrait of lost agency. The elegant, fiercely intelligent Susanna is buried alive beneath this primitive feeding machine. The only breadcrumb left in this psychic nightmare is the design on the entity's shirt, a grinning cartoon pig advertising a barbecue joint located on Lexington Avenue in New York City. It is a geographic tether, anchoring this supernatural possession to a very real, physical destination. The paralysis of denial. The psychological toll of this possession bleeds into the physical world, observed through the terrified, helpless eyes of a husband. Eddie awakens in the shadowed loft of the barn to witness the entity using his wife's wheelchair, prowling the moonlit yard with mechanical, directionless intensity. The suspense here is entirely internalized. Eddie is paralyzed not by physical restraints, but by the overwhelming, suffocating power of denial. When the figure disappears into the dark recesses of the barn, followed shortly by the sharp, terrified squeal of a young animal, the implications are horrific. He watches as the woman wearing his wife's face returns to their bed, her mouth smeared with dark, drying blood. The human mind is incredibly adept at building fortresses of rationalization to avoid unbearable truths. Eddie forces himself to believe it was only livestock, desperately avoiding the thought of the sleeping children in the nearby cabin. His silence is born of a profound, agonizing love, but it is a toxic silence that allows the monster to sleep securely by his side. The fracture of the fellowship. This toxicity is a cancer that threatens to destroy the very foundation of their group, a tragedy most keenly felt by its youngest member. Jake awakens from a psychic nightmare, having inadvertently touched the mind of the entity and witnessed the grotesque slaughter in the castle kitchen. For Jake, the horror of the bloody vision is secondary to a much deeper, philosophical devastation. He realizes that the sacred bond of their group, their unity and total transparency, has been broken. The adults, in their misguided attempts to protect, are hoarding dangerous secrets. This erosion of trust is the true death knell of their fellowship. Feeling alienated and burdened by knowledge he should not possess, Jake sneaks out into the silver light of the moon. What he witnesses next reinforces the theme that the most dangerous threats rot from within. Peering over the riverbank, he watches his new friend's father, a man entrusted with the community's defense, holding a clandestine meeting with the towering, untrustworthy messenger robot. The scene culminates with the man wading across the shallow waters, heading directly east into the dead, irradiated lands of Thunderclap. It is a staggering visual of betrayal. As Jake watches the man slip into enemy territory, the crushing realization settles in. They are surrounded by monsters, but the most lethal ones are the people they thought they knew. The burden of the din. Riding eastward beneath a chilly, deceptive sun, an eerie silence settles between the seasoned gunslinger and his young apprentice. Jake Chambers, carrying a maturity far beyond his years, turns to Roland with a pale, solemn face and speaks a phrase that belongs to a dead age: Dan Din. It is an ancient, heavy term. Psychologically, to speak it is to surrender one's emotional autonomy, opening the heart to a leader's absolute command. Roland is stunned. This boy shouldn't know the dialects of fallen Gilead, but Jake's psychic resonance has grown terrifyingly strong. He has been unconsciously skimming the surface of Roland's thoughts, catching fragments of old languages like a magpie collecting shiny glass. Yet it is not his burgeoning telepathy that troubles the boy. It is a nightmare. Jake confesses to slipping into the mind of Susanna, or rather, the parasitic entity residing within her, Mia. The boy did not witness a fractured mind seeking refuge in a fairy tale castle. Instead, he saw a brutal, ravenous survival instinct. A pregnant woman gorging on roasted swine, violently stabbing a rat to eliminate competition. This revelation shatters a comforting illusion. Susanna is not merely dissociating. Her subconscious is building a grotesque theater to cope with the demonic pregnancy hijacking her body. Jake is tormented by the fracture this secret creates within their found family, their ka-tet. 3 of them know, while Susanna remains entirely in the dark. Roland, the eternal unyielding stoic, is forced into a rare moment of agonizing vulnerability. He admits he is lost. He has been using the concept of destiny, as a shield to avoid making a devastating choice. Bound by Jake's invocation of Dan Din, they forge a grim pact. They will tell her before the bloodletting begins, But until then, Jake must bear the voyeuristic, deeply violating burden of telepathically monitoring her descent. It is a profound loss of innocence for the boy, forced to be the silent warden of a dying woman's mind. Plates of iron and grassroots rebellion. Miles away, the morning sun brings a false sense of security to the Jaffords' farm. Eddie Dean sits on the porch, whittling away his anxieties, rationalizing the horrors of the previous night. A missing pig is blamed on wild dogs, a dead rat written off as nature's cruelty. In the daylight, the terrifying reality of his wife's nocturnal hunts seems impossible. When Roland arrives, he sheds the vulnerability he showed Jake and adopts the cold, calculating aura of a warlord preparing for a siege. He bypasses the wealthy landowners and addresses Zalia Jaffords, a weathered, dirt-poor farmer's wife. He asks her directly for aid and succor. This is a masterstroke of psychological leadership. Roland understands that the true soul of Calla Bryn Sturgis does not reside in its gold or its politics, but in the calloused hands and stubborn wills of its working class. Zalia pledges her support without hesitation. Roland then asks her to teach Susanna the lethal art of throwing the razor-edged Oriza plates. This request is laced with deeper meaning. He is not merely expanding their arsenal, he is initiating Susanna into a fierce, matriarchal lineage of frontier warriors. With their weapons scarce, the gunslinger knows survival will depend on turning domestic tools into instruments of slaughter, ancient gold, and the bigot's thumb. Before parting ways, Roland bestows a quiet, melancholic miracle upon his companions. From the depths of his worn purse, he produces a leathern drawstring pouch. It is a relic of his youth, a magical grow bag from a world that has long since moved on. From this seemingly empty sack, he pours ancient silver, heavy gold pieces, and bright garnets. It is a stunning reminder of the mystical heritage Roland carries, the lingering, fading magic of his reality, comparable to tea leaves left in a dry pot. Armed with this archaic wealth, Roland sends Eddie, Susanna, and Jake into the heart of the town to Took's general store. This is not a simple shopping trip. It is a calculated psychological test of the town's temper. Inside the mercantile, the mundane ugliness of human prejudice stands in stark contrast to the cosmic threats they face. Eben Took, the store owner, is a shrieking, petty bigot who instantly attacks Jake's pet and refuses credit to outworlders. He is terrified of the disruption the gunslingers bring, preferring the comfortable oppression of the wolves over the chaos of rebellion. But Eddie and Susanna refuse to play the victims. They perform for the watching crowd of locals. When Took's hatred boils over into a racial slur, Susanna does not draw a weapon. She reaches across the counter, seizes the fat man's thumb, and bends it backward with terrifying, effortless precision. She establishes total, unapologetic dominance. The psychological shift in the room is palpable. The townspeople do not rush to the grocer's defense. They watch with quiet awe. The ka-tet is winning the war for the town's soul, proving that they bow to no one, man or monster. The unfound door and the black light. While his friends conquer the town's doubts, Roland climbs into the realm of cosmic horror. Accompanied by the ancient Mani leader Henchik, the gunslinger ascends a treacherous, sun-baked cliffside. As they navigate a path suspended over a dizzying void, a foul, noxious wind breathes from the mouth of Doorway Cave. This cavern is not merely a physical location. It is a psychological weapon. As Roland steps into the shadows, the cave extracts the deepest traumas from his scarred psyche and projects them into the air. He hears the agonizing shrieks of his dead mother, the bitter disappointment of his father, the mocking titter of the dark sorcerer Walter, and finally, the heartbreaking blare of his childhood friend Cuthbert's horn at the Battle of Jericho Hill. It is a symphony of survivor's guilt, oral ghosts designed to break a man's sanity. Deep within this nightmare stands the unfound door. It is an impossible architecture, a door of ironwood standing free in the shadows, visible only from one side, suspended over a terrifying smooth slide that drops into a chattering abyss. It bears the sigil of the rose, identical to the dimensional doorways Roland encountered on the western shores. Henchik recounts the terrifying history of this place. Years ago, lured by a cryptic voice echoing from a battery-powered machine left by an unknown agent, Henchik and his friend Jemin found a man lying unconscious before this door. But the true horror was the box beside him. The artifact within, Black 13, emanated a light that defied the laws of nature. It was a suffocating, unnatural black radiance, bleeding with the horrific red hue of the Crimson King's eye. It was a sensory paradox that radiated pure, soul-crushing despair. Black 13 is not just a magical sphere. It is a localized black hole of malice, capable of tearing the mind apart and draining the life force of those who near it. Henchik only survived by slamming the box shut, though the exposure eventually claimed his friend's life. Roland listens to this grim history, his mind racing. He realizes that this darkest of artifacts, this concentrated orb of evil, might be their only twisted path forward, a doorway to anywhere, anywhen, and perhaps to the Dark Tower itself. As they prepare to descend back to the world of the living, Roland shakes the old man's hand. As their grips meet, a sharp pain flares in Roland's fingers. He ignores it, hiding the creeping arthritis consuming his right hand. He is a dying man racing against the decay of his own body, preparing to weaponize the ultimate darkness to save a rotting universe. The weight of the savior. The exhaustion that settles into the bones of a gunslinger is a unique and heavy kind of fatigue. It is not merely the physical ache of miles walked or the bruised aftermath of battles fought. It is the deep, spiritual erosion that comes from being perceived as a savior by desperate people. Eddie, Susanna and Jake return from their impromptu town hall meeting on the porch of the local general store, feeling entirely hollowed out. They have spent hours fielding questions, shaking hands, and offering political reassurances to the terrified citizens of the Calla. The psychological toll of the public eye is immense. They are warriors accustomed to the clarity of a drawn gun, not the murky, draining waters of public relations and idol worship. Even the billy bumbler, Oi, is exhausted from the endless petting and attention. When the local housekeeper informs them that their resting places have been prepared in the middle of the afternoon, the concept of a bed seems almost alien to Eddie. The sheer luxury of safety, of a soft mattress in the daylight, underscores the relentless, brutal pace of their journey thus far. Jake quickly claims the priest's vacant room, slipping into a deep sleep alongside his loyal animal companion, while Eddie and Susanna retreat to the guest quarters. Despite the looming threat of the impending battle, they find a fleeting moment of intimacy and peace, drifting off in each other's arms. Meanwhile, Roland arrives back at the rectory after completing his own grim rounds. He is a man who carries the weight of countless worlds on his shoulders, yet he still finds a moment of quiet solace. The housekeeper greets him warmly, fully aware of the violent tempest that is about to descend upon their town. She guides the gunslinger to a hidden, moss-draped spring, offering him a brief, physical reprieve from the arthritis and the agonizing burden of his long years. It is a quiet reminder that even the most hardened instruments of fate require a moment of human warmth before the inevitable slaughter begins. Room 577 and the Sister's Wrath. As evening descends and the shadows stretch long across the screened-in porch, the ka-tet gathers around the table, their bellies full of a quiet dinner. The old priest, carrying the heavy burden of his past, finally resumes his harrowing tale. He takes them back to the sterile, claustrophobic corridors of a New York hospital in 1981. The ambient horror of the scene is not rooted in monsters, but in the cold, mechanical reality of life support. The rhythmic, mocking beeps of intensive care machinery that sound eerily similar to an airplane's navigational equipment, guiding a soul into the dark. The priest enters the room of his mutilated friend, only to be confronted by the victim's twin sister. What follows is a devastating psychological dismantling. The sister does not offer forgiveness. She offers a mirror to the priest's catastrophic failures. She slaps him, a sudden, jarring physical manifestation of her profound grief and rage. Her anger is utterly justified, which is what makes it so incredibly destructive to the priest's fragile psyche. She verbally eviscerates him, pointing out that her brother was a brilliant, promising writer before he was dragged down into the squalid trenches of addiction recovery alongside his so-called friends. She exposes the ugly truth of the savior complex. The do-gooders who surround the broken often vanish when the ultimate price is extracted. The sister leaves him alone with the bandaged remains of his friend, a man who now resembles a tragic horror movie victim. When the dying man finally speaks, his raspy warning chills the blood. He reveals that the sadistic street thugs who tortured him were actually looking for the priest. They were agents of a higher, darker power, disguised in the mundane clothing of street punks. The dying man begs his friend to flee, to stay far away from their old haunts. As the alarms of the life support machines begin to shriek, signaling the end, the terrified priest makes a cowardly but necessary decision to run, abandoning the city and the ghosts of his failures. The washateria trap. Fleeing the hospital, the priest wanders the concrete labyrinth of the city, his mind a turbulent ocean of guilt and fear. The psychological pull of nostalgia and trauma is magnetic. Despite the mortal danger, he finds himself drawn back toward the very neighborhood where his enemies lurk. It is the irrational, self-destructive impulse of the addict, circling the drain of his own demise. He walks past a towering wooden fence, his senses suddenly screaming that something is profoundly wrong. The supernatural alarms in his head begin to blare, but the realization comes too late. He is ambushed by the very monsters who butchered his friend. They are not grand Gothic vampires, but something far more insidious. Two human thugs, a towering giant, and a hyperactive, sadistic runt. The horror here lies in the banality of evil. These are cruel, prejudiced men who have been hired by supernatural forces, proving that cosmic darkness easily recruits from the lowest dregs of humanity. They drag him into the suffocating gloom of an abandoned laundromat, a setting that reeks of bleach, old dust, and the sickly sweet memory of fabric softener. It is a masterful juxtaposition of mundane urban decay and visceral, paralyzing terror. The physical assault is brutal and immediate. They incapacitate him with agonizing strikes, binding his wrists and ankles with the cold efficiency of duct tape. As the larger thug snaps photographs of the torture, the smaller one babbles with a sickening, rabid excitement, clutching a razor-sharp scalpel. They plan to carve a symbol of hatred into his flesh, to mark him before they execute him. The priest lies helpless on the linoleum, drowning in the scent of his own blood and vomit, realizing the absolute absurdity of his end. He had battled ancient vampires and navigated hidden highways across dimensions, only to be slaughtered like an animal by two ignorant street thugs in a forgotten washateria. The cosmic irony is suffocating. As the cold blade approaches his forehead, he resigns himself to the dark, convinced that his god has long since died and abandoned this forsaken world. An unlikely cavalry. But in the complex, interwoven tapestry of fate, salvation rarely arrives with majestic trumpets or angelic choirs. Just as the blade is poised to strike, the suffocating darkness of the laundromat is obliterated by the blinding glare of an industrial searchlight. Two mysterious men burst into the room wielding firearms that dwarf the cheap pistols of the street thugs. The voice booming from behind the light is not that of a seasoned warrior, but of a terrified, desperate civilian pushing himself to the absolute brink. The rescuers do not attempt to arrest the attackers. They issue a frantic, breathless countdown, demanding the thugs strip off their clothing and flee. The psychological terror is instantly inverted. The sadistic bullies, stripped of their power and their garments, are reduced to trembling, pathetic creatures who bolt into the unforgiving city night. The blinding light clicks off, revealing the silhouette of a slightly overweight man whose ragged breathing betrays his absolute lack of combat experience. As this unlikely savior cuts the bindings from the battered priest, a crucial detail emerges. A heavy signet ring on the man's finger, engraved with the Latin phrase for "from the books." The rescuers refuse to identify themselves, acutely aware of the dangerous game they have just interrupted. They vanish into the night, promising only to watch from the shadows until the paramedics arrive. The priest lies bleeding on the dusty floor, profoundly altered by the encounter. The intervention of these two ordinary, terrified men shatters his cynical belief that the world is entirely devoid of grace. In a universe governed by dark forces and predatory monsters, the ultimate act of rebellion is the compassion of a stranger. Fate, it seems, has intervened, preserving his life for a purpose he cannot yet comprehend. Rock bottom in Topeka. However, surviving a supernatural hit does not magically cure the diseases of the mind. Trauma is rarely a pathway to instant enlightenment. More often, it is the dark fuel that sustains the burning fires of self-destruction. The priest's journey across the country devolves into a hazy, agonizing blur of alcohol abuse. He escapes the vampires and the animalistic thugs, only to surrender entirely to the bottle. His descent culminates in the bleak grey dawn of a Topeka jail cell in the winter of 1982. This is the true anatomy of hitting rock bottom. It is not a poetic realization, but a grotesque physical collapse. As a police officer drones through an alphabetical list of names in the distant corridor, the priest's body betrays him. The severe alcohol withdrawal triggers a massive, violent seizure. He thrashes helplessly on the concrete floor, his muscles snapping like taut cables, losing complete control of his bodily functions. He lies in a puddle of his own filth, his face swelling from a newly broken jaw, utterly convinced that his life is bleeding out on the cold stone. Yet, in the darkest, most humiliating depths of his existence, a singular, piercing thought penetrates the fog of his agony. He remembers the two terrified men in the New York laundromat who risked everything to save a stranger. He realizes that by drinking himself to death, he is spitting on their sacrifice. In that squalid cell, staring at the dust bunnies on the floor, he makes a desperate psychological bargain with the universe. He promises to stay sober for one single year to honor the men who gave him a second chance. If he fails, he resolves to end his own life. It is a bleak, uncompromising vow, but it is enough. The grip of his addiction is finally challenged by a fragile, newborn sense of purpose. The sombre illusion. True recovery is a painstaking, precarious architecture, built one harrowing day at a time. The priest embraces sobriety, eventually finding his way to Detroit, where he dedicates himself to running a chaotic, underfunded homeless shelter. For a time, he believes the cosmic predators have lost his scent. He has traded the grand battles of good and evil for the quiet, grinding nobility of helping the destitute. But evil is infinitely adaptable. When brute force and intimidation fail, the darkness dons a tailored suit and hides behind the polished glass of corporate philanthropy. In late 1983, a letter arrives from the Sombra Corporation, promising a miraculous $1 million grant to the struggling shelter. The The lure of financial salvation blinds the priest and his colleagues. The psychological trap is brilliant in its simplicity. It uses their own desperation and desire to do good as the ultimate bait. They arrive at a pristine, upscale office building, completely unaware that they are walking into an elaborate slaughterhouse. The conference room doors slam shut with the terrifying finality of a crypt. The illusion of corporate benevolence vanishes, revealing a room packed with bloodthirsty vampires and sinister low men. Leading them is a man wearing a garish yellow shirt, his forehead marked by a horrific, ceaselessly bleeding eye. The villains do not plan to kill the priest outright. They intend to infect him with a lethal virus, ensuring a slow, agonizing demise that will remove him from the cosmic chessboard forever. In a breathtaking moment of clarity and defiance, the priest refuses to be a victim. Driven by sheer survival instinct and a refusal to be corrupted, he sprints across the room and hurls himself through the reinforced glass of the 33rd story window. As he plummets toward the unforgiving pavement of the city streets, he embraces the fall, believing it to be his final absolute escape from the nightmare. The unfound door and the dark eye. But in the vast, interconnected architecture of this universe, death is rarely an ending. It is merely a threshold. The priest does not awaken to the pavement, nor to the traditional heavens or hells of his lost faith. He opens his eyes to the stifling heat of a desert and the scent of exhausted ancient hay. He is inside an abandoned way station, a purgatorial rest stop between dimensions. The ambient horror is palpable. The only sounds are the weary thud of a water pump and the distant, maddening chime of invisible bells. In the center of this desolate stable stands a freestanding door, unattached to any wall, bearing the cryptic word unfound. It is here that he encounters the architect of his misery, a waxy, robed figure known as Walter, the dark sorcerer who weaves the threads of destiny for the Crimson King. Walter reveals that the priest's escape was no escape at all. He is merely a pawn, being repositioned on a much larger, darker board. Walter points to the distant desert horizon, where two specks, the gunslinger and his young companion, are marching toward their fate. The psychological torment reaches its absolute zenith when Walter forces a wooden box into the priest's hands. As the lid falls open, the true nature of cosmic terror is revealed. Inside rests a smooth, black glass sphere, pulsing with an insidious, living light. It is a piece of the wizard's rainbow, the very eye of the Crimson King. Looking into the depths of Black 13 is to stare directly into the abyss of ultimate insanity. The sphere rips away his sanity, flooding his mind with the screaming voices of his past failures. The sheer, incomprehensible evil of the object forces the unfound door open, violently pulling the priest through the fabric of reality. He tumbles into the dark void, shrieking in absolute mind-shattering terror as the monstrous eye gazes deep into his naked soul. He crashes onto the bone-littered floor of a faraway cave, his consciousness mercifully completely annihilated by the trauma. A seed in the desert. When the priest finally awakens days later, he is in the care of the Mani, a stoic spiritual people of the Calla. He has survived the impossible transition, evolving from a broken alcoholic wanderer into the respected elder of the town. He builds a church, locking the malevolent black sphere away, though its dark gravity continues to pull at his mind, occasionally throwing his consciousness across time and space. He finishes his tale, the weight of the years hanging heavily in the quiet air of the porch. The ka-tet sits in a stunned, reflective silence. The psychological implications of the story are staggering. The young boy, Jake, pieces the puzzle together, realizing that the two terrified men who saved the priest in the New York laundromat were the very same bookstore owners they had encountered in their own timeline. The realization sends a shiver through the group. The invisible strings of destiny, of Ka, have bound them together long before they ever met. They are caught in a web so vast and intricate that free will seems almost like a comforting illusion. As the old priest retires for the night, leaving the weary travelers alone in the dim light of the dying candles, the heavy silence returns. Roland attempts to close their council, but he is interrupted by a voice so small and fragile it barely resembles the fierce warrior they know. Susanna looks at her companions, her eyes carrying a sorrow and a weariness that eclipses the horrors they have just heard. With a quiet, devastating finality, she confesses the terrifying truth that has been gnawing at her sanity. She reveals that she believes she is carrying a child. She covers her face and weeps, the ultimate psychological horror blooming not from an external monster, but from a dark, parasitic dread taking root within her own body. The journey continues, but the shadows have never been darker. The eyes of the sun. In the borderlands, the morning sun climbs high over Rosalita Munoz's humble dwelling. The gunslinger, a man forged by centuries of relentless pursuit and unimaginable loss, finds himself stepping into a sky-blue outhouse. Here, the scent of the astringent, saucy Susan plant masks the mundane reality of the place. But what captures his attention isn't the wooden structure itself. It's a framed image of the man Jesus, hands steepled in prayer, gazing eternally upward. For a wanderer from a world that has moved on, the religious iconography of our reality is both bizarre and darkly amusing. He notes with sheer relief that the figure is depicted in profile. To be stared down by a deity while answering nature's call would have been a bridge too far, even for a hardened killer. The sheer absurdity of the moment breaks his stoic facade, and he barks out a rare laugh. It is a fleeting second of levity for a man who carries the weight of all existence upon his weary shoulders, but the shadows of destiny, the inescapable pull of Ka, wait just outside the door. Sleep is a luxury, a brief pause in the ceaseless rhythm of his violent life. The time for tales and rituals has ended. Now, the grim work of survival must begin. A clash of faith and survival. Stepping out into the late morning light, Roland seeks an audience with Father Callahan. The fallen priest, dressed in his somber clerical garb, stands as a complex contradiction of faith and failure. The gunslinger, though entirely devoid of any Catholic dogma, approaches the man not for spiritual absolution, but to secure a vault for a terrible secret. He unfurls the dark truth that has been festering within his chosen family, his ka-tet. Susanna, their fierce companion, harbors a demonic entity in her womb. Mia, a distinct and dangerous personality, has taken root within her shattered mind, threatening to tear their unity apart from the inside. What ensues is a profound psychological collision between two men governed by entirely different moral compasses. Roland, pragmatism personified, hints at the dark necessity of excising the demonic fetus before it can inevitably slaughter its host. To him, this is no child. It is a biological parasite, a venomous mechanism designed to destroy. But Callahan, anchored by the unyielding bedrock of his religious dogma, recoils in pure horror. To the priest, abortion is a mortal sin, an unforgivable murder, regardless of whether the seed was sown by a monster from the abyss. He threatens to ignite the righteous fury of the entire town against Roland's group if they dare pursue such a dark remedy. Here, we witness the terrifying isolation of leadership. Roland realizes he cannot force the priest to see the universe through a gunslinger's eyes, where the survival of the tower eclipses all mortal morality. He accepts a grim stalemate, maneuvering Callahan like a piece on a grand chessboard. He extracts a vow. Callahan must watch Susanna like a hawk, for the subtle, terrifying tells of Mia's emergence, the compulsive rubbing of the brow, the sudden staccato bursts of speech, the jerky, unnatural twitches, Roland binds the priest to their cause through sheer intimidation, demanding reparations in blood to his own missing fingers if his beloved Rosalita is harmed by the demon's spawn. Shadows, secrets, and grey horses. The web of secrets does not end with the priest. Eddie Dean, buzzing with the nervous energy of a man who has just uncovered a vital piece of a lethal puzzle, pulls Roland aside. He relays a whispered confession from an old man of the village. Beneath the horrifying masks of the wolves that raid their lands, the beasts ride steeds of identical uniform grey. A flash of predatory triumph ignites in Roland's eyes. Identical steeds imply machinery and mass production, not invincible phantoms. The sheer psychological relief of knowing your enemy is a constructed entity rather than an immortal demon is a profound tactical advantage. Yet as the gunslingers immerse themselves in the local culture, engaging in the complex social dance the locals call Kamala, new anxieties begin to sprout. Young Jake Chambers carries a heavy burden of his own. While observing the town's subtle rhythms, the boy's piercing intuition, his touch, snags on a jagged anomaly. He has witnessed his new friend's father, Benny Slightman, sneaking across the river toward the dark and evil lands of Thunderclap. Worse, Jake realizes the man's cherished eyeglasses are a fabricated lie, a cover story hiding a far more sinister truth. The agonizing psychological weight of this secret threatens to crush the boy. He is torn between his profound loyalty to his new friend and his sworn duty to his ka-tet. It is a brilliant illustration of innocence colliding with the corrosive nature of war, forcing a child to harbor suspicions that could ultimately sentence a man to death. The crosshand kill. The preparations for the impending slaughter continue as Susanna takes to the field to master the local weaponry, the lethal razor-edged throwing plates known as the unfound dish of Ariza. Outfitted with a custom dual-pouch rig strapped to her wheelchair, she becomes a terrifying spectacle of focused violence. With the chilling battle cry of the local sisters, she unleashes her fury against a chalked silhouette of a wolf painted on a barn wall. In a mere 3 seconds, her arms blur in a crosshand motion, embedding 8 plates in a perfect, deadly line down the target's center. The sheer psychological impact of this display on the watching townsfolk is palpable. They are awestruck, paralyzed by the sudden realization that these outsiders are apex predators capable of unimaginable slaughter. For Susanna, the act is almost a religious release. She compares the sensation to the lethal grace of a hunting hawk dropping upon its prey. It is the purest distillation of the gunslinger's creed. She does not aim with her hand, she kills with her heart. Later, a private competition is held among the townswomen to cull the weak from the strong. They hurl plates at root vegetables perched atop decoys, pushing their accuracy to the absolute limit. When one woman misses and breaks down in tears of shame, Roland offers a tender, unexpected comfort, showcasing the deeply hidden empathy beneath his hardened exterior. Ultimately, Rosalita claims victory at an impossible distance, proving that desperation and willpower can forge lethal skill in the most unlikely of individuals. Yet, despite these small triumphs, the shadow of the looming battle grows ever longer, a deal in another wear. As the dust settles on the makeshift shooting gallery, the subtle dynamics of the group continue to shift. Jake, driven by an unvoiced premonition and his secret knowledge of the traitorous Slightman, formally requests to carry his Ruger pistol at all times. He approaches Roland not as a child asking for a toy, but as a soldier demanding his weapon. Roland, sensing the boy's desperate need for autonomy in a world spiraling out of control, grants the request, though an unspoken tension hangs heavy in the air. The gunslinger knows that secrets are a venom that can rot a group from the inside, yet he allows Jake this dangerous tether. But it is Eddie Dean who delivers the final, breathtaking strategic pivot. His mind, sharpened by the ruthless streets of New York and honed by the harsh tutelage of mid-world, has cracked a fundamental puzzle. He realizes that Calvin Tower, the terrified bookstore owner guarding the vacant lot that houses the nexus of all realities, the Rose, is not waiting for a massive corporate buyout. Tower is holding out for a savior. Eddie proposes a dangerously audacious plan to use the malevolent reality-warping artifact known as Black 13 to project himself physically back to New York City in 1977. Eddie's insight into Tower's cowardice is brilliant. The man doesn't need millions. He needs a hero to buy the lot for $1 and relieve him of the terrifying burden before the Sombra Corporation claims it. It is a desperate gamble, a terrifying dive into the chaotic currents of time and space. The prospect of using the deeply evil Black 13 sends a collective shudder through the group. Jake fears the dark orb might hurl Eddie into an abyss from which there is no return, a cold void between worlds. Susanna grips Eddie's hand, her fierce love acting as a fragile anchor against the encroaching dark. Yet, the logic is undeniable. The wolves are coming for the children of the Calla, but the war for the Dark Tower is being fought across multiple dimensions simultaneously. And so, with the fate of all existence hanging by a fraying thread, the gunslingers prepare to step through the shadows once more. The slumbering sphere. In the pale, hushed hours before dawn, when the morning light is merely a whispered promise on the horizon, Roland and Eddie step into the cavernous quiet of Our Lady of Serenity. The church in the Calla feels unnatural in its emptiness, a hollow sanctuary that seems to press down on them with the weight of unseen, judgmental spirits. Yet, the supernatural dread of the empty pews is eclipsed by a far more tangible terror, a low, resonant vibration echoing from beneath the floorboards. It is a sleepy, vibrating drone, but it carries a psychic weight that chills Eddie to his core. This is the psychological burden of interacting with artifacts of the cosmos. When Roland retrieves the bowling bag from its hidden compartment, the hum elevates, vibrating with a fathomless, malignant intent. The artifact known as Black 13 is barely dormant. It is not merely an object. It is a localized nexus of pure, chaotic malice. Eddie's physiological reaction, the sudden halting of his breath, the icy prickle across his skin, is a visceral manifestation of a human mind trying to comprehend an ancient predatory void. Just the proximity to this dark sphere forces Eddie to confront the fragility of his own reality. He momentarily fears being violently cast into a shadowy limbo, completely severed from Susanna, his anchor. But Roland, exhibiting the stoic, ironclad discipline forged by a lifetime of trauma and survival, carefully places the carved ghostwood box into the strange protective metallic bag. The menacing hum is instantly muffled to a faint oceanic whisper. As they depart the church, moving toward the doorway cave, the tension shifts from cosmic dread to the grim logistics of their imminent war. Looking out over the rugged landscape toward the garnet mines, Eddie questions Roland's tactical honesty. The gunslinger has led the townsfolk to believe the children will be hidden in a dead-end canyon. But this is a deliberate deception. Roland's strategic genius is rooted in his deep, often cynical understanding of human nature. He recognizes that supernatural threats are rarely as insidious as mundane betrayal. He deduces that the wolves of Thunderclap do not employ magical tracking. They rely on a spy, a human informant nestled comfortably among the very people they victimize. It is a profound realization about the architecture of evil. The darkest forces often require the petty greeds and fears of ordinary men to function. Roland already suspects the identity of this traitor, yet he guards his thoughts, prioritizing the immediate mission over premature accusations. The echoes of the mind. The descent into the doorway cave is a journey through an acoustic purgatory. This subterranean chamber possesses a terrifying metaphysical property. It acts as a resonant amplifier for the darkest, most traumatic recesses of the human psyche. As Eddie ventures deeper, he is assaulted by auditory phantoms. The sneering, pathetic voice of his deceased brother Henry mocks him, resurrecting old insecurities and the toxic codependency that once defined Eddie's existence. He hears his mother's manipulative wails and the chaotic babble of a former drug acquaintance demanding a fix. This psychological gauntlet is a crucial threshold. The cave weaponizes grief and guilt, attempting to erode Eddie's newfound resolve by drowning him in the failures of his past. However, Eddie's reaction reveals the profound metamorphosis he has undergone. Where the old Eddie Dean would have spiraled into anxiety or sought chemical oblivion, the gunslinger's apprentice recognizes the auditory hallucinations for what they are: meaningless, weaponized static. He acknowledges the pain, but refuses to absorb it. Standing before the freestanding, magical door, adorned with intricate hieroglyphics and a rose-etched crystal knob, Eddie prepares for an unprecedented temporal leap. He must project his consciousness back to a specific epoch: the vibrant, sweltering summer of 1977 in New York City. Roland, acting as the anchor, equips him not with modern conveniences, but with the tools of their archaic trade: a rugged bag of holding and his own massive, devastating revolver. This passing of the weapon is profoundly symbolic. It is Roland anointing Eddie, trusting him completely with a piece of his own deadly legacy. As Eddie visualizes the bustling energy of 2nd Avenue, the yellow cabs, the specific music of the era, the dense, humid air of a forgotten decade, the manifestation of his will aligns with the artifact. He gives Roland the signal. The gunslinger opens the ghostwood box, exposing Black 13. Instantly, the cavern is flooded with a sickeningly sweet, dissonant chorus of Tadash chimes, a sound that threatens to tear reality apart. Through watering eyes and blinding pain, Eddie grasps the door, yanking it open to the glaring sunlight and gasoline stench of his former world. He steps through the threshold, leaving Roland behind to endure the agonizing radiation of the dark sphere. A gunslinger in Manhattan. Eddie is instantly swallowed by the relentless current of 1977 Manhattan. The sensory shock of the transition is immediate: the blaring horns, the oppressive heat, the suffocating anonymity of the urban sprawl. He quickly verifies his physical reality by colliding with an aggressive businessman, confirming he is not merely a ghost projecting into the past, but flesh and bone. Yet, the familiar comfort of his home city is immediately shattered by the sight of a dark grey Lincoln Town car parked menacingly up the street. It belongs to Enrico Balazar's criminal syndicate. This visual trigger does not induce panic. Instead, it ignites a cold, controlled fury deep within Eddie. This anger is not the erratic rage of a desperate addict, but the focused, lethal pulse of a trained killer. Arriving at the closed bookstore, the Manhattan restaurant of the mind, Eddie deduces the situation with the chilling logic of a seasoned predator. He notices the subtle signs of a struggle: an overturned coffee cup, shattered spectacles on the floor. Without hesitation, he forces his way into the dimly lit, suffocatingly silent shop, stalking toward the back room where Calvin Tower is being brutalized. The scene in the back office is a masterclass in psychological intimidation. Two imposing thugs, Jack Andolini and George Biondi, are terrorizing the defenseless, terrified bookstore owner. The room reeks of spilled gasoline. They are using Tower's most prized possessions, his rare, irreplaceable books, as leverage, threatening to incinerate them one by one until he surrenders the vacant lot destined to protect the Rose. To these men, the books are just paper. To Tower, they are fragments of his soul. What unfolds next is a brutal testament to the lethality Eddie has cultivated under Roland's tutelage. He does not cower, nor does he attempt to negotiate. He strikes with blinding, devastating precision. Biondi is neutralized instantly by 3 vicious blows from the butt of Roland's massive revolver, a sequence of violence so efficient it leaves the thug twitching in a pool of gasoline and broken glass. Eddie then turns his attention to Andolini, pinning the formidable mobster beneath him. Thrusting the monstrous barrel of the ancient gun into the soft tissue under Andolini's chin, Eddie systematically dismantles the thug's bravado. He fires a deafening warning shot into the dark, proving the weapon's apocalyptic power. Eddie doesn't just threaten Andolini's life, he promises a systematic eradication of his entire bloodline, invoking the ancient unforgiving wrath of Gilead. It is a calculated performance of terror, designed to fundamentally break Andolini's loyalty to Balazar by introducing a threat far more absolute and ruthless than the mob boss could ever be. The Hoarder's ransom. With the immediate threat violently expelled, the narrative slows, shifting from visceral combat to a tense, frustrating psychological negotiation. Calvin Tower, still trembling and visibly damaged, attempts to mask his profound vulnerability with a cup of black coffee. Eddie observes the man with a growing sense of distaste. Despite nearly losing his life, Tower remains inextricably bound to his material obsessions. This interaction illuminates a fascinating thematic parallel. Tower is an addict, just as Eddie once was. But while Eddie was enslaved to heroin, Tower is chained to his possessions. His inability to let go of his books or the vacant lot nearly cost him his life, yet he clings to them with a pathetic, irrational fervor. The depth of this obsession is revealed when Tower shows Eddie the specific volume the thugs threaten to burn. It is a seemingly unassuming Western novel, priced astronomically due to a series of absurd typographical errors on the cover and copyright page. But for Eddie, the revelation transcends bibliophilic trivia. The book is titled The Dogon, written by Benjamin Slightman Jr. The name strikes Eddie like a physical blow. The realization that the traitor in the Calla, the one selling the children to the wolves, is the father of Jake's closest friend, is a sickening twist of cosmic irony. The multiverse is tightly woven, and here, in a dusty New York bookstore, a misprinted novel serves as a metaphysical compass pointing directly to the rot at the heart of their current quest. Eddie must force Tower to abandon the city and retreat to New England, demanding he sign over the vacant lot to a newly formed protective entity, the Tet Corporation. He attempts to reason with Tower, explaining that Balazar is a despot who will inevitably retaliate with escalating, unspeakable violence. But Tower's obstinacy is infuriating. He exhibits a willful blindness, attempting to negotiate terms while standing in the literal ashes of his near demise. He refuses to abandon his store unless Eddie agrees to transport a heavy, glass-fronted case of his most valuable books through the magical doorway. This demand is a staggering display of misplaced priorities. Tower is willing to jeopardize the lives of his protectors and potentially the structural integrity of the entire universe to safeguard a collection of paper. Furthermore, Tower presents an ancient, brittle envelope containing a will from 1846, holding the name of a fated savior. When Eddie correctly identifies the name as Roland Deschain, proving their preordained cosmic connection, Tower finally acquiesces, though his compliance remains frustratingly conditional. Eddie realizes with grim clarity that destiny, has bound the fate of all worlds to a cowardly, selfish hoarder. It is a bitter pill, highlighting the often absurd and unworthy vessels through which monumental destiny operates. The pull of the void. Back at the doorway, the physical toll of their endeavor becomes terrifyingly apparent. Roland sits in the dirt, effectively paralyzed by the malignant radiation of the open ghostwood box. Black 13 is a parasitic entity, and its unshielded presence has driven agonizing, splintering pain deep into the gunslinger's already failing joints. The Tadash chimes are a psychological acid, wearing down his formidable mental defenses. When Eddie returns and demands help pulling the heavy, absurd bookcase through the portal, Roland must summon a superhuman reserve of willpower to simply stand. The transition of the furniture across the threshold is visually disorienting, a violent intersection of two incompatible realities. The moment the case crosses over, the doorway and the box attempt to snap shut, eager to sever the connection. Roland, defying the overwhelming pain, forces his fingers beneath the lid, holding the void open just long enough for Eddie to cross back into the cave. The instant the box is sealed, the crushing atmospheric pressure evaporates. The silence that follows is not peaceful, but the exhausted, gasping quiet of a near-death survival. Roland is physically ravaged, his body betraying the silent decay he fights to hide from his companions. As they stand outside the cave, catching their breath in the cool wind, the disparity between their epic struggle and Calvin Tower's petty greed hangs heavily between them. Eddie is disgusted by the bookstore owner's prioritization of first editions over the fate of existence. Yet beneath the irritation regarding Tower, a far darker truth anchors their conversation. Eddie voices his deduction about the Slightmans. The misprinted book was not merely a coincidence, but a glaring neon sign woven into the fabric of reality. Roland quietly admits he already suspected the elder Slightman, noting that the man is the only person in the Calla who wears spectacles, a subtle detail that points to a life of secret observation and betrayal. The tragic implication is clear. Jake, the young boy who has finally found a semblance of childhood friendship, is unknowingly fraternizing with the son of the enemy. Eddie suggests they intervene to spare the boy the pain of this discovery, but Roland refuses with chilling pragmatism. In the merciless mechanics of Ka, everyone has a part to play, and Jake is no longer just a boy. He is a gunslinger in training. The chapter closes not with a triumphant victory, but with the grim acknowledgement of the brutal emotional sacrifices that lie ahead. The physical pain Roland endures is but a shadow of the psychological wounds they must all inflict and endure to protect the Tower. Shadows of the Dogan. The sun bleeds out over the rocking bee ranch, leaving behind a sky the color of bruised violets and cooling ash. For two boys, Jake Chambers and Benny Slightman, the daylight hours had been consumed by the innocent, exhausting labor of moving hay and swimming in the deceptive currents of the river. It was the kind of idyllic, golden afternoon that belonged to a normal childhood, a commodity Jake left behind the moment he stepped into Midworld. While Benny falls into the deep, untroubled slumber of a boy who believes his father is a hero and his home is a sanctuary, Jake lies awake on the hard floor. His mind is a restless engine. He is a child soldier in a world that has moved on, anchored only by the heavy revolver in his bedroll and the profound, telepathic loyalty of his Billy Bumbler, Oi. There is a psychological weight to the silence in Benny's room. Jake's affection for the local boy is genuine, a desperate grasp at the normal adolescence he was robbed of in New York. Yet, hovering over this friendship is a dark, formless suspicion. Jake cannot shake the memory of seeing Benny's father secretly convening with the town's towering silver robot, Andy. It is the curse of the gunslinger's path. Kai, the wheel of destiny, demands vigilance, replacing childlike trust with cold, calculating paranoia. When the silver light of the moon finally spills through the window, Jake is roused by the gentle, persistent tug of Oi's teeth. Slipping into the night, the boy saddles a docile pony and crosses the shallow waters of the river, leaving the pastoral safety of the Calla behind. The moment he steps onto the opposite bank, the atmosphere undergoes a violent, metaphysical shift. This is the edge of Endworld, a poisoned, decaying landscape where the air feels heavy with unseen watchers. It is a terrain of psychic dread, radiating the malignant energy of a dying universe. Jake's flesh prickles. The comforting illusion of childhood strips away entirely, leaving only the hardened survivor, comforted merely by the cold steel of the weapon pressed against his ribs. Following a scent trail with uncanny precision, Oy leads Jake through an arid graveyard of forgotten technology. The sand is littered with the rust and ruin of the old ones, ancient circuit boards, shattered glass, and the faded logos of discarded soda bottles. This debris serves as a haunting reminder of a civilization that achieved miracles before annihilating itself in a storm of hubris. The surreal nightmare deepens as they crest a hill guarded by massive mutated cactuses. These are not mere plants. They are predatory sentinels left over from some ancient biological warfare. As the spiny barrel-like arms swivel blindly toward the scent of the boy and his horse, dripping a toxic white sap, the sheer hostility of this geography becomes agonizingly clear. Escaping the blind sentinels, Jake descends toward a structure that defies the primitive aesthetic of the local villages. A curved metallic military bunker bathed in the sterile, buzzing glow of fluorescent lights. This is the Dogan, Outpost 16. It stands as an architectural ghost of the world before it moved on, a medium security installation requiring a verbal passcode. Relying on the mystical recurring number that haunts their ka-tet, Jake speaks the password, and the heavy pneumatic door seals him inside a sprawling control room. What Jake discovers inside shatters any lingering hope of Calla Bryn Sturgis being a hidden refuge. The room is a panopticon of surveillance. Banks of glowing monitors display every intimate corner of the town, from the dusty main street to the private sanctuary of the local rectory. The sheer scale of the violation is paralyzing. The invisible masters of Thunderclap have been watching generations of townsfolk live, love, and die, treating them as nothing more than livestock in a meticulously monitored pen. Suddenly, the monitors reveal approaching figures, Benny's father and the silver robot, Andy. Panic, visceral and suffocating, grips Jake. If he is discovered, he will be slaughtered to protect their secret. He retreats into a dusty, claustrophobic electronics closet, clutching Oy's snout to stifle any noise. In the suffocating darkness, Jake becomes a silent witness to a betrayal that will forever stain his soul. Through the facility's hidden speakers, Jake listens to the chilling dialogue between the traitor and the machine. The psychological dynamics are horrifying. Ben Slightman is a man broken by love, bargaining his own humanity to save his only son from the monstrous fate of the wolves. He justifies his treason as a father's ultimate sacrifice, yet the robot offers no sympathy. Andy, a machine built to sing to children and deliver messages, reveals a core of sadistic, artificial malice. The robot mocks the humans who abuse and command him in town, finding a cruel electric joy in their impending doom. The true master of this nightmare is revealed when the robot establishes a screeching modem connection to a facility called Al Ghul Ciento, speaking with a cold, inhuman operative named Finley Otego. Slightman meticulously reports the ka-tet's defensive strategies, revealing the exact cavern where the town's children are to be hidden. In this cramped closet, breathing the dust of a dead age, Jake loses the last vestiges of his innocence. He realizes the agonizing truth. Benny's father is condemning 100 children to a life of screaming, mutated agony just to spare his own flesh and blood. When the traitors finally depart, Jake slips away into the night, carrying a secret that feels heavier than the world itself. He knows that to win this war, he will have to destroy the father of the only friend he has in this world. The Piper and the Painted Door. The heavy, overcast sky threatening rain serves as a fitting canopy for the gathering of the ka-tet in the town pavilion. Roland, the last gunslinger, anchors the group with a quiet, terrifying pragmatism. Around him stand Eddie, Susanna, Jake, and Father Callahan, a disgraced priest seeking redemption. They are bound by an invisible, unbreakable thread of fate, yet the air between them is thick with unspoken anxieties. Susanna harbors a dark, terrifying secret concerning the unnatural life growing within her, hoping wildly that her body might just absorb the nightmare. Roland, however, refuses to offer false comfort. The time for soothing lies has passed. The bloody arithmetic of survival is all that remains. When Jake shares the devastating intelligence he gathered at the Dogan, the emotional toll is raw and immediate. The boy, caught between the ruthless demands of a gunslinger's duty and the fragile empathy of a child, breaks down. Tears streaking his dusty face, Jake begs Roland not to kill Ben Slightman. It is a profound psychological fracture. Jake understands the necessity of eliminating a spy who would doom 100 children, yet his heart breaks for Benny, who will be utterly destroyed by his father's unmasking. Roland, wearing the weary, deadened expression of a man who has ordered the deaths of too many friends, promises only to do what he can. He warns them that his upcoming public speeches will be woven with lies to bait the traitors. The path to victory, as always, is paved with deception and culminating in 5 minutes of brutal, unapologetic slaughter. The horrific reality of their situation is perfectly encapsulated as the sound of children singing drifts into the pavilion. It is a joyful rhythmic chant, led by the gleaming silver figure of Andy the robot. He twirls a baton wrapped in bright silk, acting as a festive parade marshal for the town's twins. To the townsfolk, this is a charming, beloved tradition. To the ka-tet, it is a scene of grotesque psychological horror. Eddie watches the robot, his smile wide and his eyes burning with a homicidal rage, whispering venomous insults masked as cheerful greetings. This machine, playing the Pied Piper, is literally dancing the children toward their own spiritual and physical mutilation. The sheer cognitive dissonance of the moment, the innocent laughter of the doomed echoing against the cold, calculated betrayal of the metallic Judas, cements the Tet's resolve. Meanwhile, Father Callahan embarks on a drastically different kind of mission, stepping through the magical threshold of the doorway cave and plunging back into the bustling, overwhelming sensory overload of New York City in 1977. For a man who has spent seasons wandering the decaying, quiet expanses of mid-world, the deafening roar of traffic, the smell of exhaust, and the sheer density of human life is both a shock and a balm to his bruised soul. He navigates the concrete labyrinth only to discover a scene of violent ruin. The bookstore, owned by Calvin Tower, a crucial ally in their quest, is nothing but a charred, gutted husk, taped off by police. The mob has exacted its fiery vengeance, a stark reminder that evil is not confined to mutant wolves and rogue robots. It thrives in the greedy, violent hearts of men in every universe. Driven by an instinct he cannot fully articulate, Callahan walks toward a vacant lot on 46th Street, a pilgrimage to the epicenter of all realities. As he approaches the wooden fence, the ambient noise of the metropolis fades, replaced by an ethereal, angelic choir. It is the rose, the botanical manifestation of the Dark Tower itself. The sheer spiritual magnitude of the flower projects a song of universal harmony that bypasses the priest's ears and resonates directly within his soul. For a man who lost his faith to the bite of a vampire and the bottom of a whiskey bottle, this proximity to the divine is overwhelmingly redemptive. He weeps, laying his hands against the splintered wood, finally understanding the true cosmic stakes of Roland's relentless march. Beneath a torn poster, he finds the clue he needs, a zip code pointing to a rural town in Maine, a breadcrumb left by the fleeing bookseller. Back in the gloom of the doorway cave, shielded from the maddening psychic chimes of the void by makeshift earplugs, Roland investigates the cache of books Calvin Tower sent through the portal. The gunslinger is a man of action, unaccustomed to the written word of this alien world, but his keen eyes scan the covers. He struggles through the alien syllables, holding a volume of Sherlock Holmes, puzzling over the concept of fictional narratives. But then, Roland's eyes lock onto a specific book cover. It depicts a church with a blood-red sun setting behind it. The letters, though difficult to decipher, spark a terrifying flare of recognition in his mind. The town, the church, the name of the priest who just stepped through the door. The implications strike the gunslinger with the force of a physical blow. A profound, existential terror washes over him. He realizes that the events of their lives, the bloody history of his world, and the very companions who stand beside him might be nothing more than the engineered imaginations of an author residing in another dimension. The horrifying possibility that their free will is an illusion, that their suffering is merely entertainment printed on paper, threatens to unravel his sanity. Yet Roland is the last of the line of Eld. He possesses a will forged in the fires of a dying world. Knowing that this metafictional revelation would shatter the fragile minds of his companions, who are already buckling under the weight of an impending war, he makes a calculated, agonizing choice. He hides the book. He swallows the cosmic dread, burying the secret deep within his heart. When Callahan returns from the vibrant streets of New York, triumphant with his newly acquired intelligence, Roland greets him with a fabricated smile and a steady hand. The battle for the Calla is mere days away, and the gunslinger knows that whether they are men of flesh and blood or mere ink on a page, they must stand, they must fight, and they must kill. The gathering of the Falcon. Tian Jaffords had never tasted fear quite like the ash that coated his tongue as he stood upon the stage, looking out over the gathered populace of Calla Bryn Sturgis. Looking down at the silent, expectant faces of his neighbors, Tian realized the terrifying gravity of what he had set into motion. The sky overhead was an unsettling canvas, a pellucid blue swallowed by bruised, ominous clouds rolling in from the southwest. It was what his grandfather would have called weirding weather, a physical atmospheric manifestation of the town's collective dread. Out in the constant darkness of Thunderclap, silent lightning flashed like great apocalyptic sparklights. Tian's terror was not merely rooted in the impending arrival of the child-stealing wolves. It was a profound, existential dread of the salvation he had summoned. The gunslingers, these outworlders dealt in death. It was their sustenance, the very bread and wine they consumed. By calling upon them, Tian had invited the Grim Reaper into his home, desperately hoping the scythe would swing outward toward the Badlands, rather than inward toward his family. When Roland of Gilead finally steps onto the stage to accept the hallowed Opopanax feather from Tian, the atmosphere shifts from palpable panic to breathless awe. Roland's eyes are a chilling, ancient blue in the torchlight, betraying none of the warmth a savior ought to possess. Yet his understanding of human desperation is absolute and masterful. He looks upon the crowd and sees not just frightened farmers, but starving souls desperate for a sliver of hope to cling to. And so, the last gunslinger begins to feed them, a masterpiece of calculated deception. Roland lays out a defensive strategy, but the true brilliance of his speech lies in what he does not say, and the magnificent strategic lies he weaves for the spies hiding in plain sight. He addresses the town, claiming the wolves are merely undead husks, mindless zombies and vampires controlled from Thunderclap. He assures the townsfolk that while these creatures are clad in heavy armor, they are fatally vulnerable at a specific gill located just above their hearts. He dictates that the town's resistance will ambush these creatures by hiding in the scree below the abandoned mines, striking them from below. Watching from the sidelines, Eddie Dean is struck by a profound psychological revelation. Growing up on the harsh, unforgiving streets of New York, Eddie had seen every shade of hustler and con artist, but witnessing Roland manipulate this crowd elevates mendacity to a high, almost holy art. Roland knows that traitors dwell within the assembly, specifically the smiling, silver-tongued robot Andy and the ranch foreman Ben Slightman. By feeding them this highly detailed, utterly fabricated battle plan and false physical weakness, Roland is weaponizing the enemy's own arrogance. He is actively exploiting the complacency of Thunderclap. Roland understands that absolute honesty is a luxury the doomed cannot afford. By constructing this intricate mythology, a lie so beautifully detailed that it demands to be believed, Roland is playing a high-stakes game of psychological chess against an unseen enemy. He is banking on the fundamental flaw of all tyrannical regimes, their bloated, unquestioning arrogance. Leadership, in its rawest form, often requires the leader to stain their own soul with deceit to protect the innocent. Later, when Roland privately confirms the fake plan with Slightman, watching the foreman swallow the bait whole, the trap is beautifully, tragically set. The chimes of Black 13 chimes. While the town prepares for war, a different sort of battle unfolds within the claustrophobic, oppressive confines of the Doorway Cave. Eddie and Father Callahan are tasked with utilizing the most dangerous artifact in their possession, the glass known as Black 13. This is no mere magical relic. It is a sentient, malevolent orb of ghostwood and dark glass, vibrating with a cosmic malice that threatens to unravel the sanity of anyone who dares open themselves to its frequency. The plan requires Callahan to step through the unfound door to 1977 New York, and subsequently to a quiet, sunlit country road in East Stoneham, Maine. His mission is to deliver a desperately needed warning letter to Calvin Tower and Aaron Deepno, securing the safety of the vacant lot back in their home world. Stepping out of the portal, Callahan is struck by the jarring juxtaposition of mundane reality and the apocalyptic stakes of his journey. He interacts with a cheerful local clerk and a kindly blue-haired postmistress, surrounded by the comforting pedestrian scents of an old general store and the innocence of a rural town. It is a world blissfully unaware of the multiverse's decay, highlighting the tragic fragility of those who live far from the tower's shadow. But back in the cave, Eddie is left alone as the keeper of the door, and the psychological horror of Black 13 begins to take its brutal toll. The artifact emits the to-dash chimes, a hypnotic, maddening sound that slowly etches a pattern of despair into the very surface of Eddie's brain. For Eddie, a man who has spent the darkest years of his life fighting the chemical chains of heroin addiction, the chimes represent a terrifyingly familiar seduction. They offer the ultimate cosmic narcotic. They do not attack him with physical force or overt violence. Instead, they whisper of the void, lulling his conscious mind into a lethal stupor, systematically eroding his will to exist. The glass promises an end to the struggle, an eternal sleep free from the crushing burdens of the tower. When Callahan finally steps back through the doorway, the scene he encounters is a masterclass in suspense. Eddie is tottering on the very edge of the precipice, his eyes vacant and puffy, staring down into a sheer, lethal drop. He has completely surrendered to the abyss, raising a hand to his eyes in a gesture of meaningless farewell to a cruel world. Only Callahan's desperate, lightning-fast intervention, grabbing the tail of Eddie's homespun shirt and hauling him backward, saves the younger man from stepping off the edge. As Eddie vomits over Callahan's boots, the physical reaction underscores a profound spiritual revulsion. Eddie realizes how intimately close he came to giving up his life, manipulated by a force that understands human weakness with terrifying surgical precision. Black 13 does not need to kill you. It merely needs to convince you that dying is a beautiful idea. The encounter leaves them both shaken, a brutal reminder that the evil they fight is not just out on the battlefield, but lurking in the quiet, isolated spaces of their own minds, secrets in the shadows. As the fateful day of Wolf's Eve approaches, the absolute unity of the ka-tet begins to fray under the suffocating weight of unshared burdens. The encroaching battle demands absolute focus, yet the individual members are fighting terrifying, solitary wars within themselves. Susanna Dean retreats to the physical isolation of an outhouse, her body gripped by agonizing, unnatural contractions, Her lower belly feels as hard as stone. She's experiencing a physical violation that transcends mere pain. It is the psychological horror of hosting a parasite. The entity known as Mia is rising, threatening to eclipse Susanna's consciousness entirely. Looking down at her own shadow stretching across the grass, Susanna is confronted with a distorted, impossible silhouette that defies the geometry of the morning sun. Her dark passenger is growing impatient. The terror she feels is absolute, a cold dread that sinks into her very bones, yet she chooses to swallow it. She masks her agony behind a brave, unwavering smile. She prays to whatever higher power might listen, begging for just 3 more days of autonomous self-control. Her silent sacrifice is a profound testament to her love for her ka-tet, recognizing that revealing her demonic pregnancy now would shatter their fragile concentration and doom the children of the Calla. But the cost of this silence is a terrible, gnawing isolation. She is fighting a war on 2 fronts, and one of them is entirely within her own flesh. Parallel to Susanna's silent agony is Jake Chambers, a boy who has been violently stripped of the privilege of innocence. Jake spends his final night before the battle at the Rocking Bee Ranch, sharing a room with his young friend, Benny Slightman. As Benny chatters enthusiastically about the upcoming fight, boasting of heroics and dreaming of glory by Jake's side, Jake is drowning in a sickening ocean of guilt. Jake carries the heaviest secret a child can bear. He knows that Benny's father is the traitor. He knows that the man Benny looks up to is actively working to orchestrate the enslavement of the town's children. Lying in the dark, staring up at the ceiling, Jake is paralyzed by the agonizing duality of his existence. He loves his friend, yet he must play the role of the ignorant companion, smiling through the ultimate betrayal. The emotional dissonance is so severe that Jake fleetingly wishes for death in the coming battle, viewing the grave as a merciful escape from the crushing responsibility of his knowledge. When Benny innocently remarks that he will miss Jake and speaks of a future in their quiet little town, Jake's internal monologue is utterly devastating. He knows Benny's world is about to be violently unmade. In the suffocating silence of that bedroom, Jake Chambers is forced to grow up, locking his heart away in a vault of necessary cruelty. It is a quiet, devastating psychological tragedy, occurring miles away from any gunfire. The fall of the Tin Man. The ultimate confrontation with betrayal arrives not with a roar, but with a cheerful, metallic song. Eddie and the farmer Tian Jafford set their snare for Andy, the messenger robot. Andy is a relic of a forgotten epoch, a gleaming pinnacle of ancient technology that has decayed into an instrument of horrific cruelty. There is something deeply disturbing about a machine programmed to exude warmth and sociability while simultaneously funneling the town's children into the meat grinder of Thunderclap. Andy's very existence is a grotesque perversion of technological intent, a smiling Judas made of steel and wire. Eddie lures the robot toward the rectory's outhouse under the guise of revealing the ka-tet's heavy weaponry. Andy approaches, his optical sensors flashing blue with artificial delight, utterly confident in his superiority over the fragile human beings he has betrayed for generations. But Eddie is a survivor of a much harsher world, and he harbors no illusions about the sanctity of a smiling face. In a moment of abrupt, shocking violence, Eddie draws Roland's sandalwood-gripped revolver and fires point-blank, utterly obliterating the robot's optical sensors. The facade of the helpful servant shatters instantly. Plunged into sudden, chaotic darkness, Andy's reaction is terrifying. The machine thrashes wildly, emitting a deafening, apocalyptic siren and screaming in a voice entirely devoid of its former syrupy charm. The robot's panic is visceral, a massive, blinded beast tearing at the wooden walls of its confinement. Eddie and Tien force the incredibly heavy machine backward into the outhouse, slamming the reinforced door shut against its flailing, murderous limbs. Through the splintered wood, Eddie initiates the final psychological execution. He demands the machine shut down, but Andy stubbornly refuses. The robot hides behind the impenetrable firewall of its programming, arrogant in its assumption that this outworlder lacks the exact override command. But Eddie holds the ultimate key, the cryptic reality-bending verse found scrawled on a dusty wooden fence back in his own version of New York. He delivers the dual password with lethal precision. 1999. The silence that follows is more profound than the deafening gunfire. When Andy finally responds, the artificial rage is gone, replaced by a pathetic, almost infantile whisper. The machine begs. It pleads for its life, mournfully pointing out that its depleted power cells mean this shutdown will be an eternal death. But Eddie looks at the ruined doorway and sees only the hollowed-out lives of the generations of Calla twins who were sacrificed to maintain this machine's dark masters. He feels no pity, only the cold, satisfying finality of justice. As Andy's automated voice loops its bleak shutdown sequence, Eddie turns away, content to leave the corrupted Tin Man buried in the filth where he belongs. That evening, the town gathers for a massive feast on the green. It is a surreal, poignant tableau. These people know that by tomorrow night, their homes may be reduced to smoking ash, yet there is a strange, giddy liberation in their defiance. For decades, they have lived under the suffocating blanket of compromise, allowing their children to be stolen to preserve their illusion of peace. Now, having chosen the path of resistance, they find a sudden, unexpected clarity. Wayne Overholser, the wealthy farmer who had initially counseled cowardly submission, approaches Roland with his hat humbly in his hands. Driven by the sheer, overwhelming guilt of standing aside while others bleed, Wayne begs to join the frontline defense. Roland accepts him, a quiet acknowledgement that courage, much like fear, is highly contagious. As the sun sets on the eve of the wolves, Roland sits on the bandstand, watching the people he has sworn to protect. The preparations are complete. The magnificent lies have been planted. The traps are set. The wind of the Seminon begins to blow, signaling that the storm is finally coming. There is no longer any room for hesitation. In the heart of the gunslinger, there is only the cold, unbreakable resolve to stand against the dark and to fight until the enemy is broken or the ka-tet is wiped from the face of the earth. The march before the dawn. The eerie pre-dawn light stretches across the smooth, packed dirt of the East Road, illuminating a procession that feels less like a rescue mission and more like a macabre funeral march. A dozen white-canopied wagons roll quietly through the desolate landscape, looking like low-hanging clouds tethered to the earth. Inside these wagons sit 99 children, the vulnerable targets of a generational curse, remaining entirely silent as the horrific reality of their situation looms over them. The air is thick with a suffocating tension, the kind of heavy, breathless anticipation that only precedes a slaughter. At the helm of this desperate caravan are the gunslingers and the fiercest defenders of the town, their eyes locked on the eastern horizon. They are waiting for the dust cloud. They are waiting for the wolves. To understand the psychological weight of this moment is to understand the burden of command. Roland of Gilead sits on the peak seat, his mind a cold, calculating engine. He knows that in the brutal arithmetic of war, survival often demands an unspeakable price. He has positioned his pieces on the board, but the human heart is a chaotic variable, and sitting right beside him is the embodiment of that chaos. Ben Slightman, the town's traitor. The anatomy of treason. The confrontation between the ancient gunslinger and the terrified father unfolds in hushed, jagged whispers over the rattling of the wagon wheels. Slightman, pale and trembling behind his spectacles, finally addresses the terrifying truth that Roland has known for days. The gunslinger has deduced his betrayal, understanding that Slightman leaked their defenses to the enemy. This quiet moment offers a profound psychological insight into the nature of treason. Betrayal rarely wears the face of pure malice. More often than not, it is draped in the desperate, pathetic garments of parental love. Slightman sold out his neighbors, his friends, and the children of his own town for a singular, selfish guarantee, the safety of his only son, Benny. Roland's interrogation is devoid of empathy. He pierces through Slightman's rationalizations with a terrifying hypothetical, asking the broken man if he would have murdered Roland's surrogate son, Jake, to protect his treacherous secret. The tragic, devastating answer is yes. Slightman would have bathed his hands in innocent blood to keep his own child breathing. Through this grim confession, the dark lore of the enemy's true purpose is unraveled. The wolves do not steal children to feast on their flesh. They are harvesters of the mind. The unseen masters of this nightmare require a specific telepathic enzyme, a psychic nourishment found only in the brains of twins. This stolen essence is harvested to feed the breakers, captive telepaths who are being used to systematically destroy the beams that hold the Dark Tower, and by extension, all of reality, together. Slightman's betrayal wasn't just a localized sin. He was unwittingly feeding the engine of the apocalypse. Roland, operating with the chilling pragmatism that defines his entire existence, spares Slightman's life not out of mercy, but out of a calculated desire to maintain the fragile order of their ambush. He strips the man of his remaining dignity, reminding him that a coward judges the world by his own reflection. The snapping bone. As the wagons reach the designated drop-off, the intricate, deadly trap is set into motion. The majority of the children are hurried into the dense, muddy concealment of the nearby rice fields, while a small, crucial diversionary team is sent up the rocky Arroyo path. Jake Chambers, Benny Slightman, and the Tavery twins are tasked with dropping personal trinkets, a broken rattle, a woven bracelet, to create a false trail of breadcrumbs for the mechanical predators. The psychology of a trap relies entirely on deception, on convincing the predator that it remains the master of the hunt. But fate, or as the gunslingers call it, K, is a wheel that crushes the unprepared and the unfortunate alike. As the twins hurry along the treacherous path, a sudden, sickening sound shatters the morning calm. Frank Tavery steps into a hidden crevice, and the unmistakable, visceral crack of snapping bone echoes against the rocks. He collapses, his ankle shattered, his sister fainting atop him in sheer, overwhelming shock. Here, we witness the terrifying evolution of Jake Chambers. A normal boy would succumb to panic, paralyzed by the sight of blood and the impending doom of the approaching dust cloud. Instead, Jake's mind shifts into the cold, detached clarity of a born killer. He slaps the hysterical sister awake and commands the terrified Benny. With the thundering hooves of the wolves echoing across the riverbed, Jake forces them to yank the boy's trapped leg from the stone, ignoring the agonizing screams that follow. It is a moment of pure, unadulterated survival instinct, showcasing how the harsh environment of Midworld accelerates the death of childhood innocence. The war in the dark. While the chaos unfolds above, a different, far more intimate horror is taking place in the stifling darkness of a buried trench beside the road. Susanna Dean waits in the damp earth, but she is fighting a psychological war within the confines of her own skull. A separate consciousness, an entity calling herself Mia, is forcefully attempting to hijack Susanna's body. This internal battle is a horrifying subversion of maternal instinct. Mia is driven by an eldritch, consuming desire to protect the unnatural demonic child growing in Susanna's womb, threatening to paralyze Susanna precisely when her found family needs her most. Susanna's sheer willpower forces the entity to yield, promising to deal with the pregnancy later, if Mia allows her to fight the impending battle. Above ground, Roland lies completely still, his mind expanding beyond his physical senses. He tracks the approaching enemy with a predator's intuition. The lore of the wolves is finally demystified in these agonizing seconds of anticipation. They are not supernatural demons or mutated beasts. They are cold, soulless robots draped in green cloaks and metallic snarling masks. They operate via hidden thinking caps, small, radar-like dishes spinning atop their heads beneath their hoods. To defeat them, the defenders must strike this localized mechanical brain. The tension stretches to a near breaking point as the robotic cavalry halts, inspecting the false trail, their mechanical sensors clicking and whirring. The trap has worked. They have taken the bait, the dragon's teeth. With a thunderous battle cry, Roland springs the ambush. The defenders erupt from the earth like mythic dragon's teeth sewn into the soil, bursting through the camouflage of dead leaves and dirt. The violence is immediate, deafening and absolute. The Sisters of Ariza unleash their razor-sharp titanium plates, which slice through the morning air with a terrifying banshee-like shriek. These deadly projectiles decapitate the wolves, severing their robotic thinking caps and sending the mechanical monstrosities tumbling from their synthetic horses in a shower of sparks and dead circuitry. Roland, Eddie, and Jake unleash a barrage of gunfire, their bullets tearing through the remaining ranks. But the true surrealism of the battle reveals itself in the weapons wielded by the wolves. As the metallic riders draw their blades, vibrant, sizzling rods of plasma ignite, weapons inexplicably identical to the lightsabers of science fiction lore. They also hurl humming silver spheres that explode with devastating concussive force. This bizarre integration of pop culture into a life-or-death massacre creates a jarring, nightmare logic. War is indiscriminate, a chaotic grinder that consumes the innocent alongside the wicked. In the frenzied crossfire, tragedy strikes with a blinding, unapologetic cruelty. A stray energy blade sweeps through the trench, decapitating Margaret Eisenhart in a horrific spray of blood. Driven mad by the sight of his second mother's severed head, Benny Slightman scrambles out of the trench in a blind panic. Before Jake can save him, one of the explosive silver spheres strikes Benny squarely in the chest, obliterating the boy in a catastrophic explosion. The sheer brutality of the boy's death serves as a grim commentary on the illusion of control. Ben Slightman sold his soul to guarantee his son's survival, yet that very betrayal inadvertently placed his son in the crosshairs of his own destruction. Car is a wheel, and its irony is vicious. The echoes of pop culture. When the final robotic rider is reduced to a twitching, smoking heap of scrap metal, the adrenaline evaporates, leaving behind a hollow, ringing silence that is quickly filled by the agonizing wails of the bereaved. The aftermath of a battle is never glorious. It is merely the grim accounting of the dead. Ben Slightman the Elder arrives at the scene, and his psychological collapse is absolute. Seeing the shattered, unrecognizable remains of the boy he sacrificed his honor to protect, the traitor is broken beyond repair. He crushes his own spectacles beneath his heel, a symbolic shattering of his own identity and the cowardly rationalizations that led him to this moment. As the townsfolk celebrate their miraculous survival in the surrounding fields, Eddie and Jake examine the metallic corpses of their fallen enemies. Pulling away the green hoods and the snarling visages, the underlying horror of the Dark Tower's universe is laid bare. The masks are striking replicas of the Marvel Comics supervillain Doctor Doom. The explosive silver spheres, upon closer inspection, bear the serial numbers of a Harry Potter model golden snitch. The realization is a chilling commentary on the nature of Roland's decaying universe. The unseen forces of Thunderclap are not creating original horrors. They are siphoning the cultural detritus of our reality, weaponizing the childhood fantasies, comic books, and fictional tales of Eddie and Jake's world. They have twisted innocent imagination into instruments of genocide. It is a profound psychological terror, The realization that the stories meant to bring joy in one world are actively slaughtering children in another. The metafictional abyss. Yet, the bitter ash of victory is far from settling. Amidst the chaotic jubilee and the weeping of the survivors, a horrifying absence is noted. Susanna Dean is nowhere to be found. The entity known as Mia has seized absolute control of her body in the aftermath of the battle, hijacking her physical form and fleeing into the barren wastelands to give birth to her monstrous child. The frantic pursuit leads Roland, Eddie, Jake, and Father Callahan up a steep, treacherous path toward the ominous doorway cave. The atmosphere shifts from the visceral horror of the battlefield to a suffocating, supernatural dread. As they approach the cavern's depths, phantom voices drift up from the dark, mocking them, echoing their deepest insecurities and fears. But the true existential terror lies not in the ghostly whispers, but in the physical remnants left behind near an unyielding magical doorway. Beside the portal sits the small bookshelf left behind by Calvin Tower. Reaching into the stash, Roland finally retrieves the terrifying secret he had placed upside down and hidden away days before the battle. He hands the specific paperback to Jake and Callahan, asking them to examine it. The book is titled Salem's Lot, and the author is a man named Stephen King. As Father Callahan flips through the worn pages, his reality shatters into a million jagged pieces. He reads about his own past, his own dark secrets, his own horrific encounter with a vampire named Barlow. He reads intimate thoughts he had never shared with another living soul. The psychological devastation of this moment is profound and deeply unsettling. Callahan is forced to confront the ultimate existential abyss. The realization that his suffering, his faith, his failures, and his very existence might be nothing more than the fabricated ink of an author from another dimension. He screams into the dark, desperately declaring his own reality against the crushing weight of the text. It is a masterful metafictional commentary on the nature of free will versus narrative destiny. Are they real people fighting for the fate of the universe, or merely characters trapped on the pages of a story, dancing on the strings of an unseen writer? While Eddie descends into a frantic, heart-wrenching panic over the loss of his wife, Roland remains the immovable anchor. Unfazed by the shattering of the fourth wall, Roland's eyes remain fixed entirely on the goal. He recognizes the book not as a negation of their reality, but as the ultimate clue. The Dark Tower is close, its gravitational pull warping the very fabric of fiction and truth. In the heart of the abyss, the gunslinger does not flinch. He simply prepares to step through the door.